Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been a New York State trooper for about 8 years now, and I can honestly say that most of the weird calls I've handled have some kind of logical explanation behind them. People see things in the dark that aren't really there, or they misinterpret perfectly normal situations because they're scared or tired or both. The human mind has a funny way of filling in the blanks when information is missing, and up here in the Adirondacks there are plenty of blanks to fill. We've got thousands of square miles of dense forest, winding mountain roads that don't see another car for hours, and small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business going back 3 generations. It's beautiful country, don't get me wrong, but it's also the kind of place where the isolation can get to you if you're not careful. The case I'm about to tell you about started in late October, which is right when the tourist season winds down and the locals brace themselves for another long winter. The leaves were already gone from most of the trees, and we'd had our first real cold snap that left a thin layer of frost on everything in the early mornings. I was working nights that month, which meant my shift started at 11 p.m. and ran until 7 in the morning. Night shifts in the Adirondacks are a different beast entirely. During the day, you've got hikers and campers and people passing through on their way to somewhere else. But at night, it's just you and the road and whatever's lurking in the darkness beyond your headlights. The first call came in around 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was parked at a rest stop off Route 28, catching up on some paperwork and trying to stay awake with what had to be my 4th cup of terrible coffee. The dispatcher's voice crackled through my radio, and I could tell right away that something about the call had unsettled her. Her name was May Ellsworth, and she'd been dispatching for the better part of 20 years, so it took a lot to rattle her. She told me there'd been a noise complaint called in from a residence up on Old Forge Road, which wasn't unusual in itself. What was unusual was that the complainant insisted someone had been calling their landline repeatedly throughout the night, and when they answered, all they could hear was static and what sounded like someone breathing on the other end. Now, harassing phone calls aren't exactly in our jurisdiction unless they cross into credible threat territory, but May explained that the caller had specifically requested a state trooper come out to the property. They'd said something about the calls being connected to an old case, though they hadn't elaborated on what that meant. The address May gave me was for a woman named Agnes Corbett, who I vaguely remembered as someone who'd lived in the area for decades. She was elderly, probably in her late 70s, and lived alone in a house that sat pretty far back from the main road. The kind of place you'd drive right past without noticing if you didn't know it was there. I radioed back that I'd head over to check it out, mostly because there wasn't much else happening that night, and because something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. When someone specifically asks for a state trooper instead of just calling the local sheriff, it usually means they think whatever's happening is bigger than a simple domestic disturbance or property dispute. I pulled out of the rest stop and headed north on Route 28, watching the darkness press in on either side of the road. The forest up here is thick enough that your headlights don't penetrate very far, and on moonless nights like that one, it feels like you're driving through a tunnel with no end in sight. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the turnoff for Old Forge Road, which was really more of a dirt track than an actual road. My cruiser bounced and rattled over the uneven surface, and I had to slow down to avoid the deeper potholes that could have torn up my suspension. The trees grew even closer together here, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little starlight there was. I'd driven maybe half a mile down this road when my headlights finally picked out the shape of a house set back in a small clearing. It was an old farmhouse-style building, 2 stories with peeling white paint, and a sagging front porch. A single light was on in one of the downstairs windows, and I could see the flickering blue glow of a television set through the curtains. I parked in the dirt driveway and took a moment to look around before getting out of the car. The property was quiet, almost unnaturally, so no wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just that heavy silence you sometimes get in the mountains that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up to the front door, my boots crunching on the gravel path. Before I could knock, the door swung open, and Agnes Corbett stood there looking like she hadn't slept in days. She was a small woman, thin to the point of being frail, with white hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed and watery, and she clutched a faded bathrobe closed at her throat. She thanked me for coming out and invited me inside without any of the usual small talk. The interior of the house was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd lived in the same place for most of their life. Lots of old furniture, family photos on every available surface, and that particular smell of old books and lavender that seems to permeate houses where elderly people live alone. She led me into a small sitting room where an ancient television was playing some black and white movie with the sound turned down low. On a side table next to a worn armchair, I could see an old rotary phone, the kind with the curly cord and the heavy handset. Agnes gestured for me to sit down on a floral-patterned sofa while she settled into her armchair. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for a glass of water on the side table, and I could tell she was genuinely frightened. She started explaining that the phone calls had begun about a week ago, always between midnight and 4 in the morning. At first, she'd thought it was just a wrong number, or maybe kids playing pranks, so she'd simply hung up and tried to go back to sleep. But the calls kept coming, sometimes 3 or 4 times a night, and they always followed the same pattern. The phone would ring, she'd answer it, and all she'd hear was static mixed with what she swore was the sound of someone breathing. What really got to her, though, was that after about the 4th or 5th night of this, she started hearing something else underneath the static. She described it as a voice, though she couldn't make out any actual words. It was more like someone trying to speak from very far away, or through some kind of interference. The voice, if that's what it was, sounded male, and seemed to be saying the same thing over and over again. She'd tried using *69 to call back the number, but it came back as unavailable. She'd even contacted the phone company to see if they could trace the calls, but they told her there was no record of any incoming calls to her number during the time she'd specified. That last part caught my attention. If the phone company had no record of the calls, but Agnes was adamant that she'd been receiving them, then we were dealing with something that didn't quite add up. I asked her if anyone else had been in the house when the calls came in, anyone who could verify that the phone actually rang. She shook her head and explained that she lived alone and rarely had visitors anymore. Most of her friends had either passed away or moved to be closer to their families, and her own children lived out of state and only called on holidays. I asked if I could examine the phone, and she nodded, watching me carefully as I picked up the handset and checked the line. There was a dial tone, and when I pressed the receiver buttons, I could hear the normal clicking sounds you'd expect. Nothing seemed obviously wrong with the phone itself, though I'm no expert in telephone equipment. I asked Agnes if she'd be willing to let me take the phone with me to have it checked out properly, but she became agitated at the suggestion. She insisted that she needed to keep the phone in case her children tried to reach her, which I understood, even though it seemed unlikely given the hour. What I did instead was ask her if she'd be willing to keep a log of exactly when the calls came in and what she heard during each one. I explained that having a detailed record might help us figure out what was going on, especially if we needed to get the phone company more involved. She agreed to this and seemed a bit calmer knowing that someone was taking her seriously. Before I left, I walked through the rest of the house with her, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure. The house was old and creaky, with plenty of shadows in the corners, but I didn't find anything out of place or any sign that someone had been trying to get inside. As I was heading back to my cruiser, Agnes called out to me from the front porch. She asked if I knew anything about a state trooper named Reuben Mallory, who'd worked in the area back in the 1980s. The name didn't ring a bell immediately, but something about the way she said it made me pause. I told her I'd have to check the records, but asked why she wanted to know. She hesitated for a moment, then said that Reuben had been the one who'd investigated a case involving her neighbor's son many years ago. The son had gone missing during a hunting trip up in the mountains and was never found. According to Agnes, Reuben had been convinced that something wasn't right about the whole situation, but he'd never been able to prove anything. She went on to explain that the voice she'd been hearing on the phone lately reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. It was only after several nights of the calls that she'd realized why it sounded familiar. The cadence of the speech, the way the words seemed to be struggling to form through the static, it reminded her of the way her neighbor's son used to talk. He'd had some kind of speech impediment when he was younger, something that made his words sound slightly slurred or difficult to understand. She quickly added that she knew it sounded crazy, that there was no way it could actually be him calling her after all these years. But the resemblance was strong enough that it had been keeping her up at night. I didn't know what to say to that. On the one hand, it was entirely possible that Agnes was just an isolated elderly woman whose mind was playing tricks on her in the lonely hours of the night. On the other hand, the specific detail about the speech pattern and the connection to an old missing person case struck me as oddly specific for someone who was just imagining things. I promised her I'd look into the old case files and see what I could find out about both Reuben Mallory and the missing person investigation. She thanked me again and went back inside, and I could see her silhouette in the window as she watched me drive away. The rest of that shift passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Agnes had told me. When I got back to the barracks in the morning, I was exhausted, but too wired to go straight home. Instead, I headed down to the records room to see if I could dig up anything on the case Agnes had mentioned. Our filing system for older cases is pretty antiquated, still mostly paper files in metal cabinets, and it took me the better part of an hour to find what I was looking for. The case file was thin, maybe 20 pages total, and had yellowed with age. The missing person's name was listed as Jason Duvall, aged 19 at the time of his disappearance in October of 1987. According to the initial report, Jason had gone on a solo hunting trip up in the mountains and had failed to return when expected. His father had reported him missing after 2 days, and a search party had been organized that included local volunteers and several state troopers. The lead investigator on the case was indeed Reuben Mallory, and his notes painted a picture of a search that had turned up almost nothing. No sign of Jason's campsite, no abandoned gear, no indication of where he might have gone. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air somewhere in those thousands of acres of wilderness. What caught my attention was a note Reuben had added near the end of the file. He'd written that during the investigation, several people in the area had reported receiving strange phone calls around the same time Jason disappeared. The calls followed a similar pattern to what Agnes had described. Late at night, mostly static, and what some people interpreted as a voice trying to speak. Reuben had looked into it and found that the calls seemed to be coming from a payphone located at a rest stop along Route 28, not far from where Jason was last seen. When he'd gone to investigate the payphone, he'd found it in working order, but the phone company had no record of any outgoing calls being made from that location during the relevant time period. Reuben's final note in the file was dated about 6 months after Jason's disappearance. He'd written that he believed there was more to the case than a simple hunting accident or a young man who decided to run away from home, but without any concrete evidence or leads, There was nothing more he could do. The case remained open but inactive, which is law enforcement speak for, we've hit a dead end, but we're not officially closing it in case something new turns up. I made copies of the relevant pages and tucked them into my jacket, planning to look into it more when I had time. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about Agnes and her late-night phone calls more than I probably should have. Part of it was professional curiosity, I'll admit. There was something about the case that didn't add up, and as a state trooper, unsolved puzzles have a way of getting under your skin. But there was also something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way Agnes had looked when she described hearing that voice on the phone, like she was genuinely terrified of something she couldn't explain or understand. I tried to track down Reuben Mallory to see if he remembered anything more about the case, but it took some doing. He'd retired from the state police back in the early 2000s and had moved to a small town near Lake Placid. I finally got a phone number for him through a former colleague and gave him a call one afternoon. When he answered, his voice was gravelly and cautious, the voice of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. I introduced myself and explained why I was calling, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Reuben finally spoke, he told me he remembered the Jason Duval case very well. It had been one of those investigations that stuck with him even after he'd retired, the kind that made him wake up in the middle of the night wondering if there was something he'd missed or some angle he hadn't pursued. He confirmed what I'd read in the case file about the strange phone calls and added some details that hadn't made it into the official report. Apparently, some of the people who'd received the calls had claimed they could hear more than just static and breathing. They'd said it sounded like someone was trying to give directions or coordinates, like they were lost and trying to tell people where to find them. Reuben had followed up on that angle and had organized additional search parties to comb areas that matched some of the fragmentary information people thought they'd heard on the calls, but they'd never found anything. No sign of Jason or any indication that he'd been in those locations. Eventually, the calls had stopped as mysteriously as they'd started, and the case had gone cold. When I asked Reuben if he'd heard about Agnes Corbett receiving similar calls recently, he went quiet for a moment. Then he asked me something that sent a chill down my spine. He wanted to know if the calls Agnes was receiving were coming in around the anniversary of Jason's disappearance. I hadn't even thought to check that detail, but when I pulled up the calendar, I realized Reuben was right. Jason had disappeared on October 23rd, and Agnes had started receiving her phone calls on October 16th, almost exactly a week before the anniversary. Reuben told me that back in 1987, the weird phone calls had started about a week before Jason was reported missing, and had continued for several weeks after. He'd never been able to establish a definitive pattern, but the timing had always struck him as significant. We talked for a while longer, and before we hung up, Reuben made me promise I'd keep him updated on what happened with Agnes. He said he had a bad feeling about the whole thing, and after 3 decades in law enforcement, he'd learned to trust his instincts. That night, I was back on shift and found myself driving past the turnoff for Old Forge Road around 1 in the morning. I wasn't scheduled to check on Agnes, and there hadn't been any new calls from her to dispatch, but something made me turn down that dirt track anyway. Maybe it was professional diligence, or maybe it was just morbid curiosity, but I wanted to see if everything was all right. The house looked the same as it had a few nights earlier, dark except for that single light in the downstairs window. I sat in my cruiser for a few minutes, watching the house and listening to the quiet. Then, at exactly 1:43 a.m. according to my dashboard clock, I saw the light in Agnes's window flicker. Not like the power had surged or anything, more like someone had walked past it inside the house. A moment later, I saw a silhouette move across the window, and I realized Agnes was up and moving around. I was about to radio in that everything appeared normal when I saw her pick up something, probably the phone, and hold it to her ear. Even from where I was parked, I could see her body language change. Her shoulders tensed, and she leaned forward slightly, like she was straining to hear something. I got out of my cruiser and walked toward the house, moving quietly out of habit, more than any real concern that I'd disturb anything. As I got closer, I could hear a faint ringing sound, tinny and distant, like it was coming from very far away or through some kind of interference. It was coming from the house, from the direction of that lit window where Agnes was standing with the phone pressed to her ear. I stopped about 20 feet from the house and listened, trying to figure out what I was hearing. The ringing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was complete and absolute. And in that moment, standing in the darkness outside Agnes Corbett's house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of primal unease that comes from knowing, deep in your gut, that something is very wrong, but not being able to articulate exactly what it is. I stood there for another minute, maybe 2, before I finally walked up to the front door and knocked. Agnes answered almost immediately, like she'd been expecting me. Agnes looked even more exhausted than she had a few nights earlier. The skin under her eyes was dark and puffy, and her hands trembled as she clutched the phone. She didn't seem surprised to see me standing on her porch at nearly 2 in the morning. In fact, she looked almost relieved, like my presence confirmed that what she was experiencing wasn't just in her head. She stepped aside to let me in, and I noticed she was fully dressed despite the hour, wearing the same clothes she'd probably had on all day. It was clear she hadn't been sleeping, maybe hadn't slept properly in days. Once we were inside, she set the phone back on its cradle with a careful, deliberate motion, like she was afraid it might ring again at any moment. I asked her if that had been one of the calls she'd told me about, and she nodded slowly. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke, and she kept glancing at the phone as if expecting it to spring to life. She told me this one had been different from the others. The static had been there, same as always, but this time, the voice underneath it had been clearer, more distinct. She said she'd been able to make out actual words, or at least she thought she had. I pulled out my notebook and asked her to tell me exactly what she'd heard, and to take her time with it. Agnes sat down in her armchair and wrapped her bathrobe tighter around herself, even though the house was warm. She said the voice had repeated the same phrase over and over, something that sounded like North Ridge, or maybe North Bridge. She couldn't be entirely certain. But what really disturbed her was that after repeating this phrase several times, the voice had said her name. Not a question, not a greeting, just Agnes, spoken in that distant, static, distorted way that made it sound like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The way she described it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I've handled a lot of disturbing calls over the years, everything from domestic violence situations to fatal accidents. But there's something particularly unsettling about a case where you can't immediately identify what the threat is or where it's coming from. I asked Agnes if she recognized the voice at all, if it sounded like anyone she knew. She hesitated before answering, and when she did speak, her voice cracked slightly. She said it reminded her of that boy who'd gone missing, Jason Duvall, but she couldn't be completely sure because it had been so long since she'd heard him speak, and the interference on the line made it almost impossible to be certain of anything. I asked if I could stay for a while, maybe wait and see if the phone rang again. Agnes seemed grateful for the company and offered to make coffee, which I accepted. While she was in the kitchen, I took the opportunity to look around the sitting room more carefully. The family photos I'd noticed on my first visit were mostly old, dating back decades based on the clothing and photo quality. There were pictures of Agnes as a younger woman, several showing her with a man I assumed was her late husband, and a few of what looked like children or grandchildren. But what caught my attention was a photo tucked into the corner of a larger frame, almost hidden behind the others. It showed a group of people standing in front of this very house, probably taken sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, based on the cars visible in the background. Agnes was in the photo, looking maybe 20 years younger, and next to her stood a family I didn't recognize. There was a middle-aged couple and a teenage boy who stood slightly apart from the others, his posture awkward and his expression uncomfortable. I was studying this photo when Agnes came back with 2 mugs of coffee. She noticed what I was looking at and explained that the family in the picture had been her neighbors back before they'd sold their property and moved away. The boy in the photo was Jason Duvall. She set the coffee mugs down on the side table and picked up the framed photo, holding it closer to the lamp so I could see it better. Jason looked like a typical teenager from that era. Lanky and uncomfortable in his own skin, with shaggy hair and clothes that didn't quite fit right. Agnes pointed out that the photo had been taken during a neighborhood gathering they'd had one summer, back when there were more people living on this stretch of Old Forge Road. She said Jason had been a quiet kid, polite but withdrawn, the kind of teenager who preferred spending time alone in the woods rather than socializing with people his own age. According to Agnes, Jason's parents had been worried about him because he didn't have many friends and spent most of his time hiking and hunting by himself in the mountains. They'd hoped that getting him involved in community activities might help him open up, but he'd always remained on the periphery of things, present but not really engaged. Agnes remembered that he'd had that speech impediment she'd mentioned before, something that made certain words come out slurred or distorted. Other kids had teased him about it when he was younger, which had probably contributed to his preference for solitude. We sat in that quiet house drinking coffee and talking about the past, and I found myself building a picture of Jason Duvall that was more complete than anything I'd gotten from the case file. Agnes told me that in the weeks before he disappeared, Jason had seemed different somehow. He'd been more energetic, almost excited about something, though he hadn't shared what it was with anyone. His parents had been relieved to see him showing more enthusiasm for life, but Agnes remembered thinking there was something slightly off about the change in his demeanor. It wasn't the normal excitement of a teenage boy. It was more intense, more focused, like he was fixated on something specific. The night before Jason went on his final hunting trip, Agnes had seen him loading gear into his truck late in the evening. She'd been out on her porch and had called out a greeting to him, and he'd responded, but had seemed distracted, in a hurry to get going. She'd asked where he was planning to hunt, and he'd mentioned something about the North Ridge area, up past where the maintained trails ended. Agnes had warned him to be careful up there because that part of the mountains was remote and easy to get turned around in. But Jason had just smiled and said he knew the area well, that he'd been exploring it all summer. That detail made me sit up straighter. North Ridge. That was almost exactly what Agnes thought she'd heard on the phone call tonight. I asked her if she'd mentioned this to Reuben Mallory back when Jason first went missing, and she said she had, that it had been one of the first things she'd told the investigators. The search parties had focused heavily on the North Ridge area because of her statement, but they'd never found any trace of Jason or his campsite. It was rough terrain up there, lots of steep slopes and dense forest with several areas where a person could easily have an accident and not be found for years, if at all. We were still talking about this when the phone rang again. The sound of it in that quiet house was jarring, and I saw Agnes flinch like she'd been struck. It was 2:47 in the morning, according to my watch. Agnes looked at me, her eyes wide and frightened, and I nodded at her to answer it. I moved closer so I could try to hear what was coming through the line, and Agnes picked up the handset with a shaking hand. She didn't say anything at first, just held the phone to her ear and listened. I could hear the static even from where I was standing, a crackling hiss that seemed to fill the room. Then I heard it. Underneath the static, barely audible but definitely there, was a voice. It was male, distorted by interference, and it was repeating something over and over. I couldn't make out the words clearly, but the cadence was rhythmic, almost like a chant or a warning. Agnes's face had gone pale, and she was gripping the handset so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I gestured for her to hold the phone away from her ear so I could listen more directly, and she did, her hand trembling as she extended it toward me. The voice was saying coordinates. I'm certain of it now, though at the time it took me a moment to recognize what I was hearing through all that interference. They were GPS coordinates, or at least parts of them, repeated over and over with the same urgency. The voice would say a series of numbers, then there would be a burst of heavier static, then the numbers would repeat, and underneath it all, barely perceptible, was what sounded like wind, like the call was being made from somewhere exposed to the elements. After about 30 seconds of this, the voice changed slightly, became more insistent, and said something else. It was hard to make out, but it sounded like "help me" or "find me." 2 words repeated with the same mechanical persistence as the coordinates. Then the line went dead. Not a click like someone hanging up, but a sudden absolute silence that was somehow worse than the static had been. Agnes carefully placed the phone back on its cradle and looked at me with an expression that was equal parts terror and desperate hope. She asked me if I'd heard it too, if she wasn't going crazy, and I assured her that I'd heard it. I'd definitely heard something, though I still wasn't sure what to make of it. I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app, trying to recall the numbers I'd heard. I hadn't caught all of them, but I'd gotten enough that I thought I might be able to work out a location if they were indeed coordinates. I told Agnes I needed to step outside and make some calls, which wasn't entirely true. What I really needed was to think about what I'd just experienced without the weight of her frightened gaze on me. I walked out to my cruiser and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the notes I'd typed into my phone. The partial coordinates I'd managed to catch pointed to somewhere in the Adirondacks. That much was clear, but I needed the full sequence to narrow it down to a specific location. I pulled up a mapping application and started playing around with the numbers, trying different combinations to see what made sense. After about 15 minutes of this, I had a location that seemed plausible. The coordinates pointed to an area on the North Ridge, exactly where Agnes had said Jason was planning to hunt. It was remote, accessible only by hiking in several miles from the nearest logging road, and it was in a section of the park that saw very little traffic even during peak season. I sat there in the dark trying to decide what to do next. On the one hand, I had a potential location that might be connected to a nearly 40-year-old missing person case. On the other hand, I had no real evidence that the phone calls were anything more than an elaborate hoax or some kind of technical malfunction that was creating the illusion of a voice in the static. But I kept coming back to one detail that bothered me. How would anyone know to use coordinates that pointed to the exact area where Jason Duvall had said he was going? That information had been in the case file, sure, but those files weren't exactly public record. Someone would have had to have specific knowledge of the case to pull off a hoax that detailed. And what would be the point? Agnes was an elderly woman living alone with no money to speak of and no obvious reason why anyone would want to frighten her this way. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made as a prank or a scam. I radioed dispatch and asked May if she could pull up any recent calls made to Agnes Corbett's number. I knew the phone company had told Agnes there were no records of incoming calls, but I wanted to verify that for myself. May came back a few minutes later and confirmed what Agnes had been told. According to the phone company's records, there had been no incoming calls to that number in over 2 weeks. The last recorded call had been from Agnes's daughter calling from out of state to check in on her. I asked May to note in the log that I'd witnessed one of these unrecorded calls firsthand and to document the approximate time it had occurred. She said she would, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. I didn't blame her. If someone had told me this story, I probably wouldn't have believed it either. I went back inside and found Agnes still sitting in her armchair, staring at the phone like it was a live snake coiled on the table. I told her about the coordinates and asked if she'd be willing to let me take a closer look at the phone itself, maybe even take it with me to have it examined by someone who understood telephone equipment better than I did. She agreed immediately, clearly eager to have the thing out of her house. I unplugged the phone from the wall jack and wrapped the cord around it, then carried it out to my cruiser. The whole time, I had this irrational feeling that it was going to ring again, right there in my hands, but it remained silent. Before I left, I made sure Agnes had my direct number and told her to call me immediately if anything else unusual happened. I also suggested she might want to stay with a friend or family member for a few days, just until we could get to the bottom of what was going on. She said she'd think about it, but didn't seem likely to actually leave. This was her home, the place where she'd lived for most of her adult life, and I could tell she wasn't the type to be driven out easily, even by something as unsettling as these phone calls. The drive back to the barracks gave me time to think about my next move. The logical thing to do would be to submit the phone for analysis and file a report about the incident, then wait to see if anything came of it. But the coordinates kept nagging at me. If there was even a chance that they pointed to something real, something connected to Jason Duvall's disappearance, then didn't I have an obligation to check it out? The case had been cold for decades, and here was potentially the first new lead anyone had seen in all that time. By the time I got back to the barracks, the sky was starting to lighten in the east, that deep blue that comes right before dawn. I secured Agnes's phone in an evidence locker and spent the rest of my shift writing up a detailed report of everything that had happened. I included the partial coordinates I'd heard and the location they pointed to, as well as Agnes's connection to the original missing person case. When I finished, I sat back and read through what I'd written, and I had to admit it sounded completely insane. Strange phone calls with no record of occurring, voices in the static giving GPS coordinates to a location connected to a 40-year-old disappearance. If I'd read this report from another trooper, I'd have serious questions about their mental state. But I'd been there. I'd heard that voice myself, and I'd seen the genuine terror in Agnes Corbett's eyes. Whatever was happening, it was real in the sense that it was having a real effect on a real person, and that meant it needed to be investigated properly. When my shift ended, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to a diner in Lake Clear and had breakfast while I thought about what to do next. The place was nearly empty at that hour, just me and a couple of truckers who sat at the counter nursing coffee and not talking to anyone. I pulled out my phone and looked at the coordinates again, then opened a topographical map application to get a better sense of the terrain. The area they pointed to was brutal, steep, and heavily forested with no trails anywhere nearby. Getting there would require at least a 4 or 5 mile hike through rough country, and that was assuming I could even find the logging road that would get me closest to the coordinates. It wasn't the kind of trip you'd make alone, especially not without telling anyone where you were going. But I also knew that if I tried to get official approval for a search operation based on what I'd experienced last night, I'd be laughed out of the room or worse, put on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation. I was still mulling this over when my phone rang. It was Reuben Mallory, the retired trooper who'd worked the original case. I'd left him a message the day before updating him on the situation with Agnes, and he was calling me back. His voice on the phone sounded rough, like he'd been up all night, and he got straight to the point. He asked if I'd experienced anything unusual during my visit to Agnes's house, and when I told him about the phone call and the coordinates, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Reuben finally spoke again, his voice had changed. There was an edge to it, something that might have been fear or might have been excitement. I couldn't quite tell which. He told me that during the original investigation, several of the people who'd reported receiving strange calls had mentioned hearing what sounded like coordinates, though none of them had been clear enough to write down or make sense of. He'd tried to follow up on it, had even brought in some people from the phone company to see if they could trace the calls or figure out where they were originating from, but they'd come up empty. The calls had been intermittent and unpredictable, and they'd always seemed to occur in the middle of the night when there were fewer people available to investigate. Reuben said he'd always suspected that whoever or whatever was making those calls was trying to communicate a location, but without clear coordinates, there had been no way to verify where they were supposed to go. The search parties had covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness based on the general area where Jason was supposed to have been hunting, but they'd never found anything conclusive. He asked me if I was planning to check out the coordinates I'd heard, and I admitted I was considering it. His response was immediate and forceful. He told me not to go alone, that if I was going to investigate this, I needed to take someone with me and make sure people knew where I was going. The concern in his voice was genuine, and it made me pause. Reuben had been a state trooper for over 30 years, and he wasn't the type to get spooked easily. If he was worried about me going into the mountains alone to follow up on this, then maybe I should be worried too. I told him I'd think about it and thanked him for calling. But after we hung up, I knew I was going to do it anyway. I'd come this far, heard things I couldn't explain, and if there was any chance that those coordinates led to answers about what had happened to Jason Duvall, I had to follow through. The question was when to go and who to bring with me. I couldn't exactly requisition a search team without more evidence, and I didn't want to involve any of my fellow troopers in what might turn out to be a wild goose chase based on nothing more than unexplained phone calls and my own gut feeling. But I also wasn't foolish enough to ignore Reuben's warning about going alone. These mountains had swallowed up Jason Duvall and who knew how many others over the years, and I had no intention of becoming another statistic. In the end, I decided to give it one more day. I'd go home, get some sleep, and then see if anything else developed. If the phone calls continued, or if I could get any additional information that might support what I'd experienced, then I'd make a decision about whether to trek into the mountains. As I paid my bill and headed out to the parking lot, the sun was fully up now, and the morning looked clear and cold. It was the kind of day that made the Adirondacks look picture perfect. All golden light and autumn colors, the kind of scenery that ended up on postcards and tourist brochures. But I'd been doing this job long enough to know that beauty and danger often existed side by side in these mountains. The same forest that looked so inviting in the daylight could become confusing mazes once the sun went down, and the same trails that seemed well marked in good weather could vanish completely in fog or snow. People came up here thinking they were prepared, thinking they understood what they were getting into, and then something would go wrong, and we'd find ourselves coordinating search and rescue operations that sometimes ended with recovery instead of rescue. I drove home thinking about Jason Duvall walking into those woods 37 years ago, confident he knew the area well, certain he'd be back in a few days with whatever game he'd been hunting. Had he known something was wrong when it started to happen, or had it been sudden, a fall or an accident that gave him no time to react? Or had it been something else entirely? Something that the official investigation had missed or dismissed? These questions rolled around in my head as I pulled into my driveway and stumbled inside, exhausted but too wired to sleep properly. I managed a few hours of restless sleep filled with dreams of static and voices calling from far away. And when I woke up in the early afternoon, I found a text message from May Ellsworth waiting on my phone. It was brief and to the point. Agnes Corbett called. Phone rang again at 11:47 a.m., same pattern. She's asking for you. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The calls were coming more frequently now, and they were happening during daylight hours too, not just in the middle of the night. Whatever this was, it seemed to be escalating, building towards something. I called May back and told her I'd head over to Agnes's place to check on her. Then I sent a message to Reuben Mallory, updating him on this latest development. His response came back almost immediately. "Be careful, this feels wrong." I couldn't have agreed more, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that I was close to something. That if I could just figure out what was really going on with these phone calls, I'd find answers that had eluded everyone else for nearly 4 decades. I arrived at Agnes's house around 3 in the afternoon to find her sitting on the front porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, despite the fact that it wasn't particularly cold outside. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past few days, her face drawn and pale, her eyes hollow. When she saw me pull up, she stood slowly and made her way down the porch steps to meet me. Before I could even ask how she was doing, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and told me we needed to talk about what she'd heard on the latest call. We went inside, and she poured us both coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting on the burner for hours, thick and bitter. Agnes sat down heavily in her armchair and told me that this morning's call had been different again, clearer than any of the previous ones. The voice had given more coordinates, a complete set this time, and had repeated them 3 times before the line went dead. But what really shook her was what came after the coordinates. The voice had said her name again, but this time it had added something else. It had said, "Agnes, please," and the desperation in those 2 words had been unmistakable, even through all the static and distortion. I felt my skin prickle as she described it. There was something deeply wrong about all of this, something that went beyond technical glitches or elaborate pranks. I asked Agnes if she'd written down the coordinates, and she nodded, producing a piece of paper with shaking hands. The numbers were written in careful, precise handwriting, each digit clear and legible. I pulled out my phone and entered them into the mapping application, and my stomach sank when I saw where they pointed. It was the same general area as the partial coordinates from last night, but these were more specific, pinpointing a location about 3 miles up into the North Ridge wilderness. Agnes watched me check the coordinates and asked if I was going to go there, if I was going to try to find whatever was at that location. I didn't answer right away because I was still wrestling with the decision myself. Every rational part of my brain was telling me this was crazy, that I was chasing ghosts based on unexplained phone calls that might have a dozen different mundane explanations I hadn't considered yet. But there was another part of me, the part that had kept me working as a state trooper through all the difficult cases and frustrating dead ends, that was telling me I had to follow this through to whatever conclusion it led to. I told Agnes I was considering it, but that I needed to make some preparations first. I couldn't just head up into the mountains on a whim, especially not into terrain as rough as the North Ridge area. I'd need proper gear, a clear plan, and someone who knew where I was going in case something went wrong. Agnes looked relieved, like she'd been afraid I'd dismiss the whole thing as the ravings of a confused old woman. She thanked me several times and made me promise I'd be careful, that I wouldn't take any unnecessary risks. I assured her I wouldn't, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed my own words. After leaving Agnes's house, I drove to an outdoor supply store in Saranac Lake and picked up some additional equipment I'd need for a backcountry hike. A better flashlight, extra batteries, emergency blankets, water purification tablets, and a handheld GPS unit that would be more reliable than my phone once I got deep into the woods. The clerk who helped me was a young guy who clearly spent a lot of time in the mountains himself, and he asked where I was planning to hike. I gave him a vague answer about scouting some areas for a potential search and rescue operation, which wasn't entirely a lie. Back at the barracks, I spent the rest of the afternoon planning my route. The coordinates pointed to a location that was accessible via an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. From where the road ended, I'd need to hike about 3 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing nearly 1,500 feet in elevation. The topographical maps showed steep slopes and several small ravines I'd need to navigate, and there were no trails anywhere near the target location. It would be slow going, probably 4 to 5 hours to reach the coordinates, and another 3 or 4 to get back out, assuming everything went smoothly. I filed a day-off request for the following day and filled out a backcountry hiking notification form, which was something we were supposed to do whenever we went into remote areas while off-duty. The form asked for my planned route, estimated time of return, and emergency contact information. I listed Reuben Mallory as my emergency contact and included detailed coordinates for where I'd be going. If something happened to me out there, at least someone would know where to start looking. The thought was less comforting than it should have been. That evening, I called Reuben and told him about my plans. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long pause before he responded. He told me he understood why I felt compelled to investigate this, that he'd felt the same pull when he'd been working Jason Duvall's case all those years ago. But he also warned me that the North Ridge area was dangerous, that people had gotten lost or injured up there before, and that I shouldn't underestimate how quickly things could go wrong in the backcountry. He made me promise to check in with him by phone before I started the hike, and again as soon as I made it back to cell service range. I tried to sleep that night but found it almost impossible. My mind kept running through scenarios, imagining what I might find at those coordinates. Part of me expected to find nothing at all, just more forest and rocks with no explanation for any of the strange occurrences. But another part of me, the part that had heard that voice on Agnes's phone, couldn't shake the feeling that I was going to find something, and that whatever it was wouldn't be pleasant. I finally drifted off sometime around 3 in the morning and woke up 4 hours later feeling groggy, but determined. The drive to the logging road took about an hour, taking me deep into the western Adirondacks where the towns got smaller and farther apart, and the forest pressed in close to the highway. I turned off the main road onto a gravel track that quickly deteriorated into not much more than 2 ruts through the undergrowth. My truck bounced and lurched over the uneven surface, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid bottoming out on the larger rocks. After about 20 minutes of this, the road simply ended at a small clearing where someone had dumped an old, rusted-out stove years ago. I parked the truck and took a moment to orient myself using the GPS unit. The coordinates I was heading for were almost exactly 3 miles away as the crow flies, but the terrain between here and there meant I'd probably end up covering closer to 4 miles of actual hiking. I shouldered my pack, checked that I had everything I needed, and called Reuben to let him know I was starting out. He answered on the first ring and made me repeat the coordinates back to him to make sure he had them right. He told me to be smart about this, to turn back if the weather changed or if I felt like anything was off. I promised I would and ended the call. The first mile wasn't too bad. The forest was open enough that I could maintain a decent pace, and the slope was gradual. But as I got deeper into the backcountry and started gaining elevation, things got more challenging. The undergrowth became thicker, forcing me to push through tangles of mountain laurel and navigate around fallen trees. The slope steepened, and I found myself grabbing onto saplings and roots to pull myself up some of the more vertical sections. My progress slowed to maybe a mile an hour, and I had to stop frequently to check the GPS and make sure I was still heading in the right direction. About 2 hours into the hike, I came across something that made me pause. There was an old campfire ring made of stacked stones, long, cold, and partially overgrown with moss. Someone had camped here at some point, though it was impossible to tell how long ago. The stones were weathered and some had tumbled away, suggesting it had been years or even decades since the fire ring was used. I walked around the small clearing, looking for any other signs of human presence, and found what looked like the remains of a tent stake rusted and half buried in the leaf litter. I pulled out my phone and took several pictures of the campsite, though I wasn't sure what good they'd do. There was no way to know if this had been Jason Duval's camp, or if it belonged to some other hiker who'd passed through this area at a completely different time. The mountains were full of these little traces of human presence. Remnants of hunting camps and old settlements and places where people had stopped for a night before moving on. Still, the timing seemed too coincidental. I was in the general area where Jason was supposed to have been hunting, and here was evidence that someone had definitely camped in this vicinity. I continued climbing, and the forest began to change. The hardwoods gave way to more conifers, and the air took on that sharp, clean smell of pine and spruce. The temperature dropped noticeably as I gained altitude, and I could see my breath misting in front of me when I exhaled. The GPS showed I was getting close to the coordinates, maybe half a mile away, but the terrain was getting worse. I had to navigate around several steep ravines and pick my way carefully across slopes covered in loose scree that threatened to slide out from under my boots. When I was about a quarter mile from the target coordinates, I started to notice something strange. The forest here was quieter than it should have been. I hadn't heard a bird call or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush for the past 15 or 20 minutes. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched, like the woods themselves were holding their breath and waiting for something to happen. I paused and listened, trying to identify what was bothering me about the stillness, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It just felt wrong somehow, in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I pushed forward, moving more slowly now and paying closer attention to my surroundings. The slope leveled out somewhat, and I found myself in a small hollow surrounded by tall spruces. The ground here was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles that muffled my footsteps. I checked the GPS and realized I was within 50 feet of the coordinates. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel adrenaline sharpening my senses. I moved forward carefully, scanning the ground and the surrounding trees for anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another rock outcropping, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. There was a depression in the ground, maybe 10 feet across and a couple feet deep at its center, like something had collapsed or been dug out and then partially filled in over time. The edges were irregular and overgrown with ferns, but the center was relatively clear. I approached the edge of the depression and looked down into it, and my breath caught in my throat. There were bones. Not many, and they were partially buried in the soil and leaf litter, but they were definitely there. I could see what looked like a section of rib cage and possibly part of a long bone, maybe a femur. They were old, weathered, and yellowed by time and exposure to the elements. Scattered around them were a few pieces of fabric, so degraded and stained that I couldn't tell what they'd originally been part of. And there, half buried near what I thought was the rib cage, was something metallic that caught what little light filtered through the trees. I pulled out a pair of latex gloves from my pack and carefully climbed down into the depression. My hands were shaking as I brushed away some of the dirt and pine needles covering the metallic object. It was a belt buckle, brass and tarnished but still clearly visible. And stamped into the brass was a design I recognized, the emblem of a local high school, the same school Jason Duval had attended. I sat back on my heels and tried to process what I was looking at. This was it. After 37 years, I'd found Jason Duval, or what was left of him. But that realization brought with it a flood of new questions. If Jason had died up here, why had no one found him during the original search? The search parties had covered this area, or at least they were supposed to have. And how had he ended up in this depression? It didn't look natural, like he'd fallen into a ravine or gotten trapped somehow. It looked more like he'd been buried, though the depression was too shallow and irregular to be a proper grave. And then there were the phone calls. How did they fit into all of this? How could a dead man, bones scattered in a forgotten hollow in the mountains, be making phone calls to an elderly woman miles away? I knew I needed to document everything carefully before I did anything else. I pulled out my phone and took dozens of photos from every angle, making sure to capture the bones, the fabric remnants, and the belt buckle. I used the GPS to mark the exact coordinates and took notes about the surrounding terrain and any other details that might be relevant. As I was doing this, I noticed something else. There were marks on some of the nearby trees, deep gouges in the bark that looked deliberate. They were old and weathered like everything else here, but they formed a rough pattern, almost like arrows or directional markers. I spent the next 20 minutes carefully examining the site without disturbing anything more than I already had. The bones, I could see, suggested that Jason's body had been here for a long time, possibly since shortly after he disappeared. The condition of the remains was consistent with exposure to the elements over several decades, but there was something about the way they were positioned, the way the depression seemed to have been created, that didn't fit with a natural death. I'd seen enough accident scenes and recovery operations to know what those usually looked like, and this wasn't it. As I was taking my final photos, my phone suddenly vibrated in my hand. I nearly dropped it from surprise because I hadn't expected to have any cell service this deep in the mountains. I looked at the screen and saw I had one bar, just barely enough for a text message to come through. It was from May Ellsworth. Agnes called again. Says the phone rang, and this time the voice said, "Thank you." She's crying. What's happening? I stared at that message for a long moment, trying to understand what it meant. Thank you. The voice had said thank you. I quickly typed out a response telling May that I'd found something significant, and that I needed her to contact the state police barracks and request a recovery team be sent to my location. I included the GPS coordinates and emphasized that this was related to a decades-old missing person case. The message took several attempts to send because the signal was so weak, but it finally went through. Then I called Reuben Mallory, and when he answered, I told him I'd found Jason Duvall. Reuben was silent for a moment, then asked me to describe what I'd found. I gave him a detailed account of the site, the bones, and the belt buckle. When I mentioned the depression and how it looked like it might have been deliberately created, Reuben's tone changed. He told me to be very careful about what I touched or disturbed, that this site might not just be a recovery operation but potentially a crime scene. I assured him I'd been documenting everything and hadn't moved any of the remains. He said he'd start making calls to get a team assembled and that I should stay at the site until someone arrived. I climbed out of the depression and found a spot where I could sit with my back against a tree and keep watch over the site. The silence of the forest seemed even more pronounced now, and I found myself listening intently for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone out here. The rational part of my brain knew that I was probably the only person within miles of this location, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. I kept thinking about those phone calls, about the voice giving coordinates that led directly to this spot. How had that been possible? Who or what had been making those calls? As I sat there waiting for the recovery team, I started putting together a timeline in my head. Jason Duvall had disappeared in late October of 1987, supposedly going on a solo hunting trip to this area. He'd told Agnes he knew the North Ridge well, that he'd been exploring it all summer. But something had happened to him up here, something that had resulted in his death and his body ending up in this shallow depression. The original search parties had covered this general area but had somehow missed this specific location. Was that just bad luck? Or had something deliberately led them away from this spot? And then the phone calls had started. First in 1987 during the original investigation, and now again in 2024, almost exactly 37 years later. People had reported hearing voices trying to give coordinates, but the technology of the time hadn't allowed for clear enough transmission to pinpoint a location. Now, with Agnes receiving clearer calls that included precise GPS coordinates, Someone, or something, had finally managed to communicate exactly where Jason's remains could be found. But that raised the most disturbing question of all. Who had been making those calls? The logical explanation was that someone alive knew what had happened to Jason and had been trying to anonymously lead investigators to his body. Maybe someone who'd been involved in his death, either accidentally or deliberately, and who'd been living with the guilt for decades. The phone calls could be their way of finally unburdening themselves without actually coming forward and facing potential criminal charges. It made sense from a psychological perspective, and it would explain the increasing frequency and clarity of the recent calls. Maybe whoever was behind this had decided it was finally time for the truth to come out. But that explanation didn't account for several things. It didn't explain why the phone company had no record of the calls being made. It didn't explain the strange static and interference that accompanied every call. And it definitely didn't explain how the voice on the phone had sounded like Jason Duval himself, complete with the speech impediment that Agnes had remembered so clearly. Unless someone had access to recordings of Jason's voice and was using them to create some kind of elaborate hoax, but why would anyone go to that much trouble? I was still wrestling with these questions when I heard the distant sound of voices and equipment being moved through the forest. The recovery team had arrived much faster than I'd expected, probably because Reuben had emphasized the urgency of the situation. I stood up and called out to let them know where I was, and a few minutes later, 3 state troopers emerged from the trees along with a forensic technician and a medical examiner. I recognized 2 of the troopers from the barracks, though I didn't know them well. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, probably wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I gave them a detailed briefing on what I'd found and how I'd come to be here, leaving out some of the more unusual aspects of the phone calls. I showed them the photos I'd taken and pointed out the depression where the remains were located. The medical examiner, a woman in her 50s named her Patricia Enright, climbed down into the depression and spent several minutes examining the site without touching anything. When she climbed back out, her expression was serious. She confirmed that the remains appeared to be human and that they'd been here for a significant period of time, consistent with the timeline of Jason Duval's disappearance. The forensic technician set up a perimeter around the site and began the careful process of documenting everything before any of the remains were moved. The other troopers and I searched the surrounding area for any additional evidence or clues about what had happened here. We found a few more pieces of degraded fabric and what looked like it might have been the remains of a backpack, so deteriorated that it fell apart when we tried to move it. About 30 feet from the depression, one of the troopers found something wedged between 2 rocks. An old hunting knife with a bone handle, the blade rusted but still intact. Dr. Enright examined the knife carefully and noted that there appeared to be some kind of inscription on the handle, though it was too worn to read clearly. She bagged it as evidence along with everything else we'd found. The recovery operation took several hours, with the team carefully excavating the remains and documenting their position. As the sun started to get lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, Dr. Enright told us she'd found something concerning. Some of the bones showed marks that were consistent with tool trauma, possibly from a knife or small hatchet. In other words, Jason Duval's death might not have been an accident. That information changed everything. What had started as a missing person case and then become a recovery operation was now potentially a homicide investigation. We'd need to get the remains back to the lab for a full forensic analysis, and we'd need to reopen the original case file and look at everything with fresh eyes. The other troopers began speculating about what might have happened, whether Jason had surprised a trespasser or gotten into some kind of confrontation with another hunter. But I couldn't stop thinking about those phone calls, about the voice saying thank you after I'd found the remains. By the time we finished securing the site and preparing to hike back out, it was nearly dusk. The forest had taken on that eerie quality that comes with fading light. where familiar shapes become ambiguous and every shadow seems to hide something. We made our way back down the mountain in single file, taking it slow to avoid injuries in the failing light. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, and my mind was reeling from everything that had happened. I'd gone into the mountains looking for answers and had found them. But those answers had only generated more questions. When we finally made it back to our vehicles, it was fully dark. The forensic team loaded their equipment and the recovered remains into their van, and the other troopers headed back toward the barracks. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, too tired to start driving right away. I pulled out my phone and saw I had several messages from Ruben asking for updates. I called him and gave him a full report on what we'd found. When I told him about the tool marks on the bones, he went quiet for a long moment before speaking. Ruben told me something he'd never included in the official case file, something he'd kept to himself for 37 years. During the original investigation, he'd spoken to several people who claimed that in the weeks before Jason disappeared, the young man had been asking questions about old mining operations in the North Ridge area. Apparently, there were rumors of abandoned claims up there, maybe even some old prospectors' cache that had never been found. Ruben had checked into it, but had found no evidence that Jason had actually located anything, or that there was anything worth finding in those mountains. But what if Jason had found something? What if he'd stumbled across something valuable or important enough that someone else wanted it badly enough to kill for it? And what if whoever had done this had been living with that secret all these years, until finally their conscience or their fear had driven them to anonymously reveal where the body was hidden? It would explain the phone calls, the coordinates, and the eventual message of thanks when the remains were finally found. Someone out there knew what had happened to Jason Duvall, and they'd been trying to make amends in the only way they could without incriminating themselves. I promised Ruben I'd keep him updated as the investigation progressed and ended the call. Then I drove to Agnes Corbett's house to tell her what I'd found. She deserved to know that her neighbor's son had been found after all these years, and that the phone calls she'd been receiving had led directly to that discovery. When I pulled up to her house, all the lights were on, and I could see her silhouette in the window. She must have been watching for me, because she opened the door before I'd even made it up the porch steps. I told her everything, and she listened with tears running down her face. When I finished, she asked if I thought Jason had been trying to reach out, trying to make sure he was found. I didn't know how to answer that. As a state trooper, I'm trained to look for rational, evidence-based explanations for everything. But I'd heard that voice on her phone, heard it giving coordinates that led directly to Jason's remains, and I couldn't explain that in any way that made complete sense. I told Agnes I didn't know, that there were a lot of things about this case I couldn't explain, but that what mattered was that Jason had finally been found and could be laid to rest properly. Agnes nodded and thanked me, and I could see some of the tension leave her body. The phone calls had stopped after that last message, the one that said, "Thank you," and she felt certain they wouldn't start again. Whatever had been trying to communicate through those calls had accomplished its purpose, and now it was done. I wanted to believe she was right, but as I drove home that night, exhausted and confused, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that there was some piece of this puzzle I hadn't found yet. The forensic analysis of Jason Duvall's remains took 3 weeks, and during that time, I found myself becoming increasingly obsessed with the case. I couldn't let it go, couldn't stop thinking about those phone calls and what they might mean. On paper, we had what looked like a cold case homicide with a victim who'd been dead for nearly 4 decades. The tool marks on the bone suggested Jason had been attacked with a knife or small hatchet, and the location of the remains indicated someone had tried to conceal the body, though not very effectively. It should have been straightforward, or at least as straightforward as a 37-year-old murder case could be. But nothing about this case was straightforward. Dr. Enright's full report raised more questions than it answered. The tool marks on the bones were consistent with defensive wounds, suggesting Jason had been conscious and fighting for his life when he was attacked. But there were also indications of blunt force trauma to the skull that had likely occurred around the same time. The pattern of injury suggested a violent, frenzied attack rather than a calculated execution. Someone had been angry or desperate, or both, when they'd killed Jason Duvall, and they'd left him in that shallow depression to be slowly consumed by the forest. What bothered me most was the timeline. According to Dr. Enright's analysis, Jason had likely died within a day or two of when he was reported missing, which meant the attack had probably occurred right around the time those strange phone calls had started back in 1987. Ruben had told me that several people in the area had reported receiving the calls during the original investigation, all describing the same pattern of static and distorted voices trying to communicate something. If Jason had died at the beginning of that time period, he couldn't have been the one making the calls. So, who was? I threw myself into reviewing every piece of documentation from the original case, spending my off-duty hours in the records room going through box after box of files. I read witness statements, search logs, phone records from 1987, everything I could get my hands on. The picture that emerged was of a thorough investigation that had simply hit a dead end through no fault of the investigators. They'd done everything right, had followed every lead, but Jason Duvall had vanished so completely that they'd had nothing to work with. The few people who'd reported those strange phone calls had been interviewed, but without any way to trace the calls or make sense of what was being said, that angle had led nowhere. One detail from the old files caught my attention. Several of the people who'd received calls in 1987 had mentioned hearing what they described as wind or rushing water in the background, beneath the static. At the time, investigators had theorized that if the calls were real and not just some kind of mass delusion or prank, they might be coming from somewhere outdoors, maybe from a payphone at a rest stop or campground. But the phone company had checked all the payphones in the area and found no record of suspicious activity. The calls had remained unexplained, and after a few weeks, they'd simply stopped. I decided to interview some of the people who'd received calls back in 1987, or at least the ones who were still alive and living in the area. Most of them were elderly now, and their memories of events from 37 years ago were understandably hazy. But a few remembered the calls clearly, and their descriptions matched what Agnes had experienced almost exactly. One woman, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Quinlan, told me she'd been so disturbed by the calls that she'd unplugged her phone for several weeks. She said the voice had been trying to tell her something important, but the interference had made it impossible to understand. When I asked Margaret if she'd felt like the calls were threatening, or if they'd seemed more like someone asking for help, she thought about it for a long moment before answering. She said that at the time, she'd been frightened because she didn't understand what was happening, but looking back, she didn't think the voice had been trying to scare her. It had sounded desperate, she said, like someone who was lost or trapped and trying to give directions to where they were. That description sent a chill through me because it matched my own impression of what I'd heard on Agnes's phone. Whatever or whoever had been making those calls, they'd been trying to lead people to Jason's remains. The investigation into Jason's death hit a wall pretty quickly. Without any physical evidence linking a specific person to the crime, and with decades having passed since it occurred, there was little the current investigators could do beyond documenting what we'd found. They interviewed people who'd known Jason, including some who were still alive from back in 1987, but no one had any useful information about who might have wanted to harm him. Jason had been a quiet, solitary young man, with no enemies that anyone knew of. The theory about him finding something valuable in the mountains remained just that, a theory with no evidence to support it. Reuben Mallory and I met for coffee one afternoon about a month after the discovery, and we went over everything we knew, trying to find some angle that might have been overlooked. Reuben had aged since I'd first spoken to him on the phone, the stress of having this old case resurface clearly taking a toll. He told me he'd spent 30 years wondering if there was something he'd missed during the original investigation, some crucial detail that would have led them to Jason's body. Now that the body had been found, he'd thought he'd finally have closure. But instead, he just had more questions. The big question, the one neither of us could answer, was about the phone calls. We'd both heard them, both witnessed their effects on Agnes and the precision of the coordinates they'd provided. But we had no explanation for how they'd been made or who'd been making them. The phone company had confirmed once again that there were no records of any incoming calls to Agnes's number during the relevant time period. They'd checked and rechecked their systems, had even brought in technical specialists to look for glitches or anomalies, but found nothing. As far as their equipment was concerned, those calls had never happened. Except they had happened. I'd witnessed one myself, had heard that distorted voice giving coordinates. Agnes had a log of dates and times when her phone had rung, and those times matched up with when I'd been at her house and heard it too. May Ellsworth had taken multiple calls from Agnes reporting the incidents. There was documentation that something had occurred, even if we couldn't explain the mechanism of how it had worked. Reuben suggested that maybe someone with sophisticated technical knowledge had found a way to spoof the phone system, to make calls that didn't register in the normal records. It was possible, I supposed, though it seemed like an enormous amount of effort for someone to go through. But if that was the explanation, it raised another question. Why now? Why had someone waited 37 years to reveal where Jason's body was hidden? Reuben had a theory about that. He thought that whoever had killed Jason might be dying or seriously ill, that they'd decided to clear their conscience before it was too late but couldn't bring themselves to actually confess to the murder. The anonymous phone calls with coordinates had been their way of making sure Jason was found and could be properly buried, while still avoiding prosecution. It was a plausible explanation, and it was certainly more rational than some of the alternatives I'd been considering. Agnes Corbett's phone calls had stopped completely after that final message, the one that said, "Thank you." Her life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a strange and frightening experience. I checked in on her periodically, and she always seemed glad to see me. She told me she felt at peace, knowing that Jason had been found, that his family could finally have some closure even though his parents were long dead and his sister had moved away years ago. The phone sitting on her side table was just a phone again, not a conduit for mysterious voices from the past. But I couldn't let it go. Something about the whole situation continued to nag at me, like there was a piece of information I was missing that would make everything make sense. I started having dreams about the North Ridge, about hiking through those silent forests and finding that depression with its scattered bones. In the dreams, I would hear that voice calling from somewhere in the trees, always just out of sight, always trying to tell me something I couldn't quite understand. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, convinced I'd been on the verge of some crucial realization. About 6 weeks after we'd found Jason's remains, I got a call from Dr. Enright asking if I could stop by her office. She said she'd found something while doing a final review of the evidence, something she wanted to show me in person. I drove down to the medical examiner's office that afternoon, curious and a little apprehensive. Dr. Enright met me in the lobby and led me back to her office, where she had several photographs spread out on her desk. They were close-up shots of some of the bones we'd recovered, specifically some of the ribs and vertebrae. Dr. Enright pointed to marks on the bones that she'd noted in her original report, the ones that had indicated Jason had been attacked with a bladed weapon. But she'd done some additional analysis and had found something unusual. The marks weren't consistent with a single type of blade. Some appeared to have been made by a knife with a smooth edge, while others showed the characteristic serrations of a saw blade, or possibly a hunting knife with a partially serrated edge. What made this significant, she explained, was that the different types of marks seemed to have been made at different times. She couldn't be absolutely certain without more extensive testing, but her preliminary analysis suggested that some of the injuries had occurred peri-mortem, around the time of death, while others appeared to be post-mortem, inflicted after Jason was already dead. In other words, someone had attacked and killed Jason, and then at some later point, someone had returned to the body and inflicted additional damage. Dr. Enright stressed that this was just a working theory and that there could be other explanations, but the pattern was distinctive enough that she felt confident in her assessment. I sat there staring at those photographs, trying to understand what this new information meant. Someone had killed Jason Duvall in a violent struggle up in the North Ridge Wilderness. Then, hours or days or even weeks later, someone had come back to the site and done something else to the body. Why would someone do that? The only explanation I could think of was that they'd been trying to make the body harder to identify, though that didn't quite fit with the relatively shallow burial and the fact that they'd left his belt buckle with him. Or maybe they'd been searching for something, literally cutting into the body, looking for something Jason had hidden or swallowed. That last thought brought me back to Reuben's theory about Jason finding something valuable in the mountains. What if he'd found some kind of cache, maybe old coins or precious metals from an abandoned mining operation? What if he'd been carrying it when he was killed, and his attacker had taken it? But then, what if the attacker had been worried that Jason had hidden some of it elsewhere, or had swallowed something small and valuable to keep it safe? That might explain why someone had returned to the body later. Might explain those post-mortem injuries. They'd been searching for something they thought Jason had concealed. I shared this theory with Dr. Enright, and she nodded thoughtfully. She said it was as good an explanation as any for what she'd found, though, of course, there was no way to prove it at this point. She mentioned that during the initial examination, they'd found some fragments of fabric in what would have been Jason's pockets, but they'd been too degraded to preserve anything useful. If he'd been carrying coins or precious metals, they would have fallen through the rotted fabric decades ago and could be anywhere in that site or the surrounding forest. We'd never find them now, assuming they'd ever been there in the first place. As I was leaving Dr. Enright's office, she mentioned something else that had been bothering her. During the examination, she'd found what appeared to be cut marks on some of the finger bones, specifically the distal phalanges. The marks were consistent with someone trying to remove Jason's fingertips, though the attempt appeared to have been incomplete or abandoned partway through. She couldn't think of any good reason why someone would do that to a body they were trying to hide in the wilderness, where identification would be difficult anyway. It was just another strange detail in a case full of them. I drove back toward the barracks, my mind churning through everything I'd learned. The case was getting more complex instead of simpler, and I was starting to wonder if we'd ever really understand what had happened to Jason Duvall up in those mountains. The official investigation would likely be closed soon, marked as a probable homicide with insufficient evidence to pursue charges. Jason's remains would be returned to what family he had left, and he'd finally get a proper burial. And the phone calls, those impossible phone calls that had led us to him, would remain unexplained. That evening, I was at home trying to relax when my phone rang. It was May Ellsworth, and she sounded shaken. She told me that Agnes Corbett had called in again, reporting another phone call. I felt my stomach drop because I'd been convinced the calls were over, that whatever had been trying to communicate through Agnes's phone had accomplished its purpose. I asked May what Agnes had said, and there was a long pause before she answered. According to Agnes, the call had been different this time. There'd been no coordinates, no desperate pleading, just a single phrase repeated over and over. Not alone, not alone. Not alone. I told May I'd head over to Agnes's house right away and grabbed my keys. The drive to Old Forge Road seemed to take forever, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my hands ache. When I pulled up to Agnes's house, I could see her sitting on the porch again, wrapped in a blanket despite the relatively mild evening. She looked smaller somehow, more fragile than she had before. I sat down next to her on the porch steps, and we didn't say anything for a while. We just sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. Finally, Agnes spoke. She told me the call had come through about an hour ago, completely unexpected after weeks of silence. The voice had been the same as before, distorted and distant, but the message had been clear. Not alone. She'd tried to ask what that meant, had tried to get the voice to explain, but it had just kept repeating those two words until the line went dead. She wanted to know what I thought it meant, if I had any idea what the voice was trying to tell her. I didn't have a good answer for her. The phrase, "not alone," could mean so many different things. Maybe it meant that Jason hadn't been alone when he died, that there had been someone else up there on the North Ridge. Maybe it meant that whoever had killed him hadn't acted alone, that there had been multiple attackers, or maybe, and this was the possibility that made my skin crawl, it meant that Jason wasn't the only victim, that there were other bodies out there in the mountains waiting to be found. I didn't share that last thought with Agnes because I could see she was already frightened enough. I stayed with Agnes for a couple of hours, and we talked about a lot of things. She told me stories about the neighborhood back when Jason was young, about the other families who'd lived along Old Forge Road and had since moved away or passed on. She talked about watching the area slowly empty out over the decades, how the isolation that had once felt peaceful had gradually become oppressive. As she spoke, I found myself wondering if that isolation had played a role in what had happened to Jason. Up here in these mountains, you could do just about anything and no one would know. A person could disappear without a trace, and the forest would swallow all evidence of what had occurred. Before I left, Agnes asked me if I thought the calls would continue. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that nothing about this case had followed any predictable pattern. But I also told her that if they did continue, we'd figure out what was going on eventually. I'd keep investigating, keep looking for answers, until I understood what had happened on that mountain and why it was manifesting in these impossible phone calls. She seemed comforted by that, though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. Some mysteries don't get solved, and some questions don't have answers that make sense within the framework of what we understand about the world. As I drove home that night, I kept thinking about those two words. Not alone. I thought about Jason Duvall hiking into the mountains by himself, confident and excited about whatever he hoped to find up there. I thought about the moment when he'd realized he wasn't as alone as he'd thought, when he'd encountered whoever had killed him. And I thought about whoever had made those phone calls, the ones from 1987 and the recent ones to Agnes. Were they alone now, living with the knowledge of what they'd done? Or were there others who shared that burden, others who knew the truth about what had happened on the North Ridge? Over the next few weeks, I made several more trips up to the site where we'd found Jason's remains. I told myself I was looking for additional evidence, for anything that might have been overlooked during the initial recovery. But truthfully, I think I was hoping to find some kind of answer, some piece of information that would make all the strange elements of this case fall into place. I never found it. The forest kept its secrets, and the hollow where Jason had lain for 37 years remained just a depression in the ground, gradually filling in with new growth. The official investigation was closed about 3 months after we'd found the body. The case was ruled a homicide with an unknown perpetrator, and Jason's file was moved to the inactive section of cold cases. His remains were released to his sister, who'd flown in from Arizona for a small memorial service. I attended along with Reuben and a handful of other people who'd known Jason or had been involved in the investigation over the years. Agnes Corbett was there too, and I noticed she kept looking around during the service, like she was expecting someone else to show up. After the memorial, Reuben and I stood in the parking lot talking about the case one last time. He told me he'd finally found some measure of peace with it, that knowing Jason had been found was enough even if we didn't have all the answers. But I could tell he was just saying what he thought he should feel, not what he actually felt. This case had haunted him for 3 decades, and finding Jason's body hadn't exorcised that ghost, it had just given it a new shape. We both knew we'd never stop wondering about those phone calls, about what had really happened up on that mountain, about whether there was more to the story than we'd ever discovered. Agnes didn't receive any more phone calls after that night when the voice said, "Not alone." Her old rotary phone sat on its table, silent and ordinary. Just an obsolete piece of technology with no mystery attached to it. I checked in on her periodically, and she always said she was fine, that she was sleeping better now. But I noticed she'd moved a newer cordless phone into her bedroom and had unplugged the old rotary entirely. She said it was because the cordless was more convenient, but I suspected she just didn't want to be anywhere near that old phone when night came. I think about this case more than I probably should. It's been over a year now since we found Jason's remains, and I've worked dozens of other cases in that time. But this one stays with me. Sometimes when I'm on night patrol, driving those empty mountain roads in the early hours of the morning, I find myself thinking about what those phone calls might have been. Were they really just an elaborate hoax? Someone with technical expertise and detailed knowledge of the original case deciding to finally reveal where the body was hidden? Or was it something else? Something that doesn't fit neatly into our understanding of how the world works? I've learned that a lot of police work involves accepting that you won't always get clear answers. Sometimes you do everything right, follow every lead, and still end up with pieces that don't quite fit together. But this case is different because I experienced something I can't explain. I heard that voice giving coordinates that led directly to a body that had been hidden for nearly 40 years. I stood in Agnes Corbett's living room and listened to a phone that, according to every record and every expert, wasn't actually receiving any calls. Those experiences don't fit into the framework of reality I'd built over 8 years of law enforcement work. Late at night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I sometimes wonder if Jason Duvall really did find something up there on the North Ridge. Not gold or precious metals, but something else, something that changed him in those final weeks before he disappeared. Agnes said he'd seemed different, more excited and focused. Maybe he'd stumbled across something in those mountains, something old and strange that the forest had kept hidden for decades or centuries. And maybe whatever he found, whatever he disturbed up there, had ultimately led to his death. There's a phrase that keeps coming back to me from Dr. Enright's report. She'd noted that some of the post-mortem damage to Jason's bones suggested someone had been searching for something, cutting and examining in a way that showed they were looking for something specific. What if they'd been looking for whatever Jason had found? What if that thing, whatever it was, had still been with him when he died? And what if it's still up there somewhere, buried in that hollow or hidden in a crevice nearby, waiting for the next person to come looking? I haven't shared these thoughts with anyone. Not Reuben or Dr. Enright or any of my fellow troopers. They'd think I was losing my grip, that the stress of the case had gotten to me. Maybe they'd be right, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this story, that those phone calls were trying to communicate something beyond just the location of Jason's body. "Not alone," the voice had said in that final call. Was it warning us about something? Telling us there were other victims out there? Or was it revealing something about itself, letting us know that whatever had killed Jason, whatever had been making those calls, wasn't acting in isolation? The Adirondacks stretch for thousands of square miles. most of it wilderness that hasn't been thoroughly explored or mapped. People go missing up here regularly, some found alive, some found dead, and some never found at all. How many of them ended up like Jason Duval, their bones scattered in some forgotten hollow, while the forest slowly reclaimed them? And how many of those disappearances might be connected in ways we've never considered? These are the questions that haunt me now. I've stopped sleeping well, wake up several times a night from dreams I can't quite remember. When I do sleep, I dream of walking through endless forests, always searching for something I can never find. And sometimes in those dreams, I hear a phone ringing somewhere in the distance, a tinny electronic sound that doesn't belong in that ancient wilderness. I walk toward it, pushing through undergrowth and climbing over fallen logs, but I never reach it. The ringing just continues, fading in and out like a signal that can't quite establish a connection. I drive past Agnes Corbett's house sometimes when I'm on patrol, just to check that everything looks okay. The lights are usually on in the evenings, and I can see her moving around inside, going about her normal routines. The phone calls haven't resumed, and I tell myself they never will, that whatever needed to be communicated has been communicated. But I keep my radio on when I'm in that area, and I make sure May Ellsworth has standing orders to contact me immediately if Agnes calls in about anything unusual. Because deep down, I don't think this story is over. The coordinates led us to Jason, but those final words suggest there's more. Not alone could mean so many things, and none of them are comforting. Sometimes I think about organizing another search of the area around where we found Jason, expanding the perimeter to look for anything else that might be out there. But I have no justification for requesting that kind of resource commitment. No evidence to support the feeling that there's something more to find. So I wait and I listen and I patrol these mountain roads, watching for anything that seems out of place. The forest keeps its secrets, the way it always has. And somewhere up on that north ridge, in places where the hiking trails don't reach and the tourists never go, there might be other stories waiting to be discovered. Other bones scattered in forgotten hollows, other mysteries that will take decades to unravel if they're ever solved at all. I've been a state trooper for 8 years now, and I thought I understood the job. Respond to calls, investigate crimes, help people who need it, and accept that some cases will never be fully resolved. But this case has taught me that there are layers to this work I hadn't considered. Questions that push against the boundaries of what I thought was possible. I heard a voice on a phone that shouldn't have been able to ring. And that voice led me to a body that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. That happened. I can't explain it. Can't rationalize it away. And it's changed something fundamental about how I see the world. Agnes Corbett once asked me if I thought Jason had been trying to reach out. If his spirit, or whatever you want to call it, had been using those phone calls to make sure he was found. I gave her a non-committal answer because I didn't know what to say. But now, after everything I've learned and everything I've experienced, I think the truth is more complicated than that. I think something up in those mountains, something that understands the deep places and the old ways, decided it was time for Jason to be found. And it used the tools it had available, obsolete phones and static and voices that shouldn't exist, to make that happen. Whether that makes me sound crazy, I don't particularly care anymore. I know what I experienced. I know there are things in these mountains that don't fit neatly into official reports or rational explanations. And I know that somewhere in that vast wilderness there are other secrets waiting to surface. Other voices that might someday find a way to call out from the darkness and the silence, asking to be heard, asking to be found, asking for someone to understand that they were not alone in whatever happened to them. That's what keeps me up at night. Not the fear of what I might find, but the certainty that there's more out there waiting to be discovered. And the knowledge that when the next impossible phone call comes through, when the next set of coordinates starts spelling themselves out through static and interference. I'll have no choice but to follow where they lead. Because that's the job, isn't it? Following the evidence wherever it takes you, even when it takes you to places that shouldn't exist and shows you things that shouldn't be possible. The phone on Agnes Corbett's side table remains silent, but I still drive past her house on my patrols, still watch for that flicker of movement in the window that might mean she's answering a call that no one else will ever have a record of. And I keep my hiking gear ready, keep those coordinates saved in multiple locations, because I have a feeling that someday soon, I'll need to make another trip up to the North Ridge. There's something up there that isn't finished with us yet, something that knows how to bridge the gap between then and now, between the living and the dead, between what we can explain and what we have to simply accept. Jason Duvall is buried now, his case officially closed. But the mystery of how we found him, and what those final words "not alone" might mean, remains open. And in the quiet moments between calls, when the radio is silent and the mountain roads stretch empty before me, I listen. Because sooner or later, that phone is going to ring again, and when it does, I'll be ready to answer. I've been patrolling the Hudson Valley as a New York State Trooper for the better part of 6 years now, and I thought I'd seen just about everything these roads could throw at me. Fatal accidents, drunk drivers, domestic disputes that spilled out onto the highway, you name it. The Taconic State Parkway in particular has a reputation among troopers. It's a beautiful stretch of road during the day, all rolling hills and autumn colors, but at night it becomes something else entirely. The curves are tight, the lighting is minimal in places, and there are sections where the forest presses in so close on both sides that your headlights barely penetrate the darkness. Most of my shifts are uneventful in the grand scheme of things. I write tickets for speeding, help motorists with flat tires, occasionally deal with an accident or a disabled vehicle. But every once in a while something happens that doesn't quite fit into the normal categories of police work. Something that makes you question what you saw or whether you saw anything at all. This is one of those stories, and even now, months after it happened, I'm still not entirely sure what to make of it. It started on a Tuesday night in late November. The weather had turned cold early that year, and we'd already had a few dustings of snow that melted by mid-morning, but left the roads slick and treacherous during the overnight hours. I was working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, which meant I had the parkway mostly to myself except for the occasional truck driver or someone heading home late from work. Around 2:15 in the morning, I got a call from dispatch about a possible injury accident on the southbound side, mile marker 47. The caller had reported seeing what looked like fresh damage to the guardrail and possibly some debris in the road, but they hadn't stopped to investigate because the area was too dangerous to pull over safely. Dispatch asked if I could head over and check it out, and I told them I was about 10 minutes away. I flipped on my lights and headed south, keeping an eye out for any signs of an accident. Mile marker 47 was in a section of the parkway that curved through some particularly dense forest with steep embankments on both sides and limited shoulders for pulling over. When I reached the area, I slowed down and scanned both sides of the road with my spotlight. Sure enough, there was fresh damage to the guardrail on the right side. The metal twisted and scraped like something had hit it hard. I activated my rear flashers and pulled over as far as I could without putting my cruiser in danger of being sideswiped by any passing traffic. I grabbed my flashlight and my reflective vest and got out to take a closer look. The damage was significant, with several sections of the guardrail bent outward and downward like a vehicle had gone through or over it. I walked along the guardrail, playing my flashlight over the damaged sections and looking for any other evidence of what had happened. There were no skid marks visible on the pavement, which struck me as odd. Usually, when a vehicle hits a guardrail hard enough to do this kind of damage, there are signs of braking or swerving beforehand. But the road surface was clean, except for some scattered pieces of reflector and what might have been broken taillight plastic. I picked up one of the pieces and examined it. It was red, the kind of plastic used in vehicle taillights, and it was fresh enough that the broken edge was still sharp. I radioed dispatch and told them I'd found the damaged guardrail, but no sign of a vehicle at the scene. I said I was going to check beyond the guardrail to see if a car had gone down the embankment. The dispatcher acknowledged and said she'd stay on standby in case I needed backup or medical response. I clipped my radio to my belt and approached the gap in the guardrail carefully, using my flashlight to illuminate the slope beyond. The embankment dropped away sharply, maybe 20 or 30 feet down to a tree line, and in the darkness, I could barely make out the shapes of the forest beyond. I started making my way down the slope, moving slowly because the ground was covered in wet leaves and loose rocks that threatened to send me sliding down faster than I wanted to go. My flashlight beam swept back and forth across the trees, looking for any sign of a vehicle or debris trail. About halfway down the embankment, I caught a glimpse of something that made me stop. There was a light visible through the trees, faint and yellowish, like a window lit from inside. That didn't make sense. According to the maps I'd studied of this area, there shouldn't be any structures this close to the parkway. It was all designated forest land, protected from development. I continued down the slope more carefully now, keeping my eyes on that light. As I got closer to the tree line, I could see it more clearly. It was definitely a window, and it was part of a structure that I couldn't quite make out through the dense foliage. I pushed through the last few yards of undergrowth and emerged into a small clearing, and what I saw there made me stop in my tracks. There was a house, a full-sized, two-story house sitting maybe 70 feet from the parkway, completely hidden from the road by the trees and the embankment. The house was old, probably built sometime in the early 20th century based on the architecture. It had a peaked roof, wooden siding that might have once been white, but was now weathered to a grayish color, and a front porch that sagged slightly in the middle. But what struck me most was how intact it looked. This wasn't an abandoned ruin or a collapsed structure. The windows were whole, the roof appeared sound, and there was that light burning in one of the first-floor windows. Someone was living here, or at least someone had been here recently enough to leave a light on. I stood at the edge of the clearing and called out, identifying myself as a state trooper and asking if anyone was home. My voice sounded strange in the darkness, swallowed up by the trees almost as soon as the words left my mouth. There was no response from the house, no movement in the lit window, no sound of anyone stirring inside. I waited a full minute, then called out again. Still nothing. I radioed dispatch and gave them my location and a description of what I'd found, and I could hear the confusion in the dispatcher's voice when she responded. She told me that according to the property records she was looking at, there were no structures registered at this location. The land I was standing on was supposed to be state forest, part of the parkway's protected buffer zone. I confirmed that I was definitely looking at a house, a substantial one, and that it appeared to be occupied, or at least maintained. She said she'd pull up some older maps and see if there was any historical record of a building here, and in the meantime, I should proceed with caution. If someone was squatting in an illegal structure on state land, they might not be happy about a trooper showing up in the middle of the night. I approached the house slowly, keeping my flashlight trained on the front door and the windows. As I got closer, I could see more details. The porch had a rocking chair on it, positioned facing out toward where I was standing. The window with the light in it had curtains that were partially drawn, and I could see what looked like a room beyond with furniture and possibly some pictures on the walls. Everything about the scene suggested a normal, lived-in house, except for the fact that it shouldn't exist. I climbed the 3 steps up to the porch, and the old wood creaked loudly under my weight. I knocked on the front door, a solid official knock that identified me as law enforcement, and called out again that I was a state trooper investigating an accident and needed to speak with whoever lived here. The sound of my knocking seemed to echo through the house, but there was no response. I tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked. The door swung open easily, revealing a narrow hallway that led deeper into the house. Now, I need to be clear about something. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't just walk into someone's house without permission or probable cause. But this situation was far from normal. I had an accident scene with no vehicle, a house that supposedly didn't exist on state land, and no response from whoever might be inside despite clear signs that someone had been here recently. The unlocked door and the lack of response to repeated announcements gave me reasonable concern that someone inside might need assistance or might be unable to respond due to injury. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the smell. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, just old. Like a place that had been closed up for a long time, musty and stale. The hallway was lit by that single window I'd seen from outside, which turned out to be the entrance to what looked like a living room. I moved toward it, my hand resting on my service weapon out of habit, and looked inside. The room was furnished with pieces that looked like they were from another era. A heavy wooden coffee table, a sofa with faded floral upholstery, a bookshelf filled with what appeared to be very old books, and on the walls there were photographs in frames. I walked into the room and examined some of the photographs more closely. They were all black and white, or faded color photos from what looked like the 1950s or 60s. Family portraits, pictures of people standing in front of this very house back when it had been in better repair. In several of the photos I could see the same woman, probably in her 30s or 40s, with dark hair and a serious expression. She appeared in multiple pictures spanning what looked like several years, and in some of them she was standing with a man who might have been her husband and what might have been children. I continued through the house, checking each room and calling out periodically to see if anyone would respond. The kitchen had an old gas stove and a refrigerator that hummed quietly, suggesting the house had power somehow. The sink had a few dishes in it, plates and cups that looked like they'd been used but not washed. Upstairs, I found 3 bedrooms, all furnished but showing signs of age and disuse. One of them had a bed that looked like it might have been slept in recently, the covers pulled back and a depression in the pillow, but there was no one in any of the rooms, no sign of where the occupant might have gone. I was standing in the upstairs hallway, trying to figure out what to do next, when I heard something. It was faint, coming from somewhere outside the house, and it took me a moment to identify what it was. It sounded like someone calling for help. I moved quickly back downstairs and out onto the porch, trying to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond the house, deeper into the forest. I grabbed my flashlight and headed in that direction, pushing through overgrown bushes and navigating around trees. About 50 yards behind the house, I found what I was looking for. There was a man lying on the ground near the base of a large oak tree, and even from a distance, I could tell he was in bad shape. As I got closer, I could see that he was middle-aged, maybe in his 50s, and he was dressed in business casual clothes that were torn and dirty. His face was pale and covered in sweat, and one of his legs was bent at an angle that suggested it was broken. When he saw me approaching, the relief in his eyes was palpable. I knelt down next to him and immediately called for medical response on my radio, giving dispatch the best coordinates I could based on my position relative to the parkway. The man was conscious but clearly in shock, and he kept trying to tell me something, his words coming out in a confused jumble. I told him to stay calm, that help was on the way, and tried to assess his injuries without moving him too much. Besides the obvious leg fracture, he had several cuts on his face and hands, and he was complaining of pain in his ribs. While I was doing this initial assessment, the man grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me closer. His voice was hoarse and desperate when he spoke, and what he said made no sense at first. He told me he'd been trying to get away from the house, that he'd been inside, and something had happened that had frightened him badly enough to run out into the forest in the middle of the night. He said he'd hit the guardrail because he hadn't been able to see properly, that his vision had been blurred or distorted somehow, and then he'd tried to climb back up to the road but had fallen and broken his leg. I asked him what he meant about getting away from the house, and his response was to point back toward the structure I'd just come from. He said he'd been driving on the parkway when he'd seen someone standing on the side of the road, a woman who looked like she needed help. He'd pulled over, or at least he'd tried to, but his car had gone through the guardrail instead. He couldn't remember much after that, just climbing down the embankment and seeing the house with its light on. He'd thought maybe he could get help there, so he'd gone inside. According to his account, he'd called out when he entered, but no one had answered. He'd walked through the ground floor looking for a phone or someone who could help him, and that's when things had gotten strange. He said the house had felt wrong somehow, like the air was too heavy or too still. And then he'd heard something from upstairs, a sound like footsteps or furniture being moved. He'd called out again, and this time someone had responded. A woman's voice, he said, but he couldn't make out what she was saying. The words had been muffled or distorted, like she was speaking from behind a closed door. He'd started up the stairs to find whoever was up there, but the higher he climbed, the more wrong everything felt. The temperature had dropped, he said, to the point where he could see his breath in the air, and the sounds from the second floor had gotten louder but no clearer. Multiple voices now instead of just one, all talking over each other in that same muffled, incomprehensible way. When he'd reached the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway, he'd seen doors opening and closing on their own, and that's when he'd panicked and run. I listened to all of this while monitoring his vital signs and trying to keep him calm. The rational part of my brain was telling me that the man was in shock and possibly concussed, that his account of what had happened was being colored by pain and trauma and couldn't be taken at face value. But another part of me, the part that had just walked through that house and felt how wrong it was, couldn't entirely dismiss what he was saying. I'd been in that upstairs hallway. I'd seen that bedroom with the disturbed bed. And I'd felt something too, though I'd tried to rationalize it away as just the natural unease of being in an unfamiliar place in the middle of the night. The man was still talking, still trying to explain what had happened to him, when I heard the sound of sirens approaching on the parkway above us. The ambulance had arrived, along with what sounded like additional state police units. I radioed up to them and gave them directions on how to reach our location, then turned my attention back to my patient. He'd gotten quieter now, his initial burst of adrenaline-fueled energy fading as the shock deepened. His grip on my arm loosened, and his eyes started to drift closed. I kept talking to him, trying to keep him conscious and alert until the EMTs could get down here with proper equipment and pain medication. It took about 10 minutes for the rescue team to reach us, navigating down the embankment with a stretcher and medical gear. I briefed them on the man's condition and the circumstances of how I'd found him, leaving out the more unusual elements of his story. They got him stabilized and loaded onto the stretcher, and I helped them carry him back up to the parkway where the ambulance was waiting. The whole time, I kept glancing back at the house, which was visible through the trees from certain angles. The light was still on in that ground floor window, unchanged from when I'd first seen it. Once the ambulance had departed with the patient, I was left with 2 other troopers who'd responded to the scene. One of them was Trent Holloway, someone I'd worked with on several occasions and generally trusted to be level-headed and thorough. I filled him in on what I'd found, including the house and its apparently impossible location on state land. Trent's reaction was skeptical but interested, and he wanted to see the house for himself. We made our way back down the embankment together, leaving the 3rd trooper up on the road to manage traffic and the accident scene. When we reached the clearing, Trent stopped and stared at the house with the same expression of disbelief I must have had when I first saw it. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures, documenting the structure from multiple angles. We approached the house together, and I led him inside, showing him the rooms I'd already searched. Trent examined everything with a careful, methodical attention to detail, photographing the furniture and the pictures on the walls. When he saw the family photos, he stopped and studied them for a long moment. He pointed to one of the photographs and asked if I recognized the location in the background. I looked more closely and realized he was right to call it out. The photo showed the woman I'd seen in multiple pictures standing in front of what was clearly this house, but in the background you could just make out a section of road that looked familiar. It was the parkway, or at least what would become the parkway, though the photo appeared to predate its construction. Trent suggested that this house might have been here before the parkway was built, back when this was all private land, and had somehow been missed or forgotten during the land acquisition process. We went upstairs together and I showed Trent the bedroom where the bed looked recently used. He examined it carefully, checking for any signs that someone had been sleeping here regularly, but the sheets were cold to the touch, and there was a layer of dust on the nightstand that suggested no one had been here in quite a while. We checked the other rooms again, looking for anything I might have missed on my first pass, but found nothing new. The house remained empty and silent except for the sound of our footsteps on the old wooden floors. Before we left, Trent suggested we check for any utilities that might explain how the house had power. We found the electrical panel in a small closet off the kitchen, and that's where things got even stranger. The panel was old, probably original to the house, but there were signs that it had been modified or updated at some point. More importantly, there were no visible connections to any external power lines. The house wasn't connected to the grid, at least not in any way we could identify. Trent theorized that there might be a generator somewhere, maybe in a basement or outbuilding we hadn't found yet, but a thorough search of the property turned up nothing. We spent another 30 minutes documenting the house and the surrounding property before finally heading back up to the parkway. By this time, it was nearly 5 in the morning, and the sky was starting to lighten in the east. The accident scene had been processed and cleared, with the damaged section of guardrail marked for repair. Trent and I stood by our cruisers comparing notes and trying to figure out what our next steps should be. The house obviously needed to be investigated more thoroughly, and we'd need to bring in people from the county assessor's office to figure out who owned the property and why it wasn't showing up in any current records. As we were discussing this, my radio crackled with a call from dispatch. She said she'd been looking into the history of the area where I'd found the house, and she'd found something interesting. According to old property records from the 1950s, there had indeed been a house at approximately that location, owned by a family named Marchand. The house and the surrounding land had been seized through eminent domain when the state began acquiring property for the parkway in the early 1960s. According to the records, the house was supposed to have been demolished as part of the construction process, but there was no documentation confirming that the demolition had actually occurred. Trent and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. If the house had never been demolished, and if it had been sitting here forgotten for over 60 years, that would explain a lot. It would explain why it wasn't in current property databases, why it wasn't connected to modern utilities, and why no one seemed to know it existed. But it didn't explain the light that had been on when I first arrived, or the refrigerator that was still running, or any of the other signs that someone had been here recently. I asked dispatch if she could find any more information about the Marchand family, specifically what had happened to them after their property was seized. She said she'd see what she could dig up and would let me know. In the meantime, Trent and I decided we should secure the house and post a notice that it was under investigation by the state police. We made our way back down the embankment one more time, taking note of how much harder it was becoming to find the place now that the sun was coming up. The trees and underbrush seemed thicker in the daylight, and the path we'd trampled through during the night had already started to grow over. When we reached the clearing, something had changed. The light that had been on in the ground floor window was now off, and the house looked somehow darker and more closed off than it had before. Trent noticed it too, and we both approached more cautiously, unsure of what we'd find. I tried the front door and found it was now locked, the knob refusing to turn despite having been unlocked just a few hours earlier. Trent pulled out his flashlight and shined it through one of the windows, and we could see the same furniture and the same photographs. But everything looked slightly different somehow. More settled, more dusty, more clearly abandoned. We spent a few minutes trying other doors and windows, but everything was sealed tight. Eventually, we decided to head back up to the parkway and contact the county to send someone out during daylight hours to do a proper search and secure the property. As we were climbing back up the embankment, I looked back one more time at the house. From this angle, partially hidden by the trees and the morning mist that was starting to rise from the ground, it looked almost like a photograph itself, frozen in time and slowly fading away. I had the strangest feeling that if we came back later, we might not be able to find it again, that it might have faded completely into whatever liminal space it occupied between past and present. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls. I wrote up a detailed report about the accident and the discovery of the house, and I spent an hour on the phone with various county officials trying to figure out what the proper procedure was for dealing with a structure that technically shouldn't exist. Everyone I spoke with was confused and skeptical, and I couldn't really blame them. The whole situation sounded impossible, like something out of a ghost story rather than a legitimate police matter. By the time my shift ended at 7 a.m., I was exhausted, but too wired to sleep. I kept thinking about that house and about the man I'd found injured in the forest behind it. He'd said he'd seen a woman standing on the side of the road, someone who looked like she needed help. And there had been that woman in all those photographs inside the house, the one who appeared to be the original owner or resident. I wondered if there was a connection, and I made a mental note to follow up with the hospital where the man had been taken to see if his story remained consistent once he'd recovered from the shock. I finally made it home around 8:30 and managed to get a few hours of fitful sleep. I dreamed about the house, about walking through those rooms and feeling the wrongness of the place seeping into my bones. In the dream, I climbed those stairs again and walked down the upstairs hallway. And this time, when I looked into the bedroom with the disturbed bed, someone was lying in it. The woman from the photographs, watching me with eyes that held too much knowledge and too much sadness. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding, and I couldn't get back to sleep after that. I went back on shift that evening, still feeling unsettled from the previous night's events. The first thing I did was call the hospital to check on the condition of the man we'd pulled out of the woods. The nurse who answered told me he was stable and recovering from surgery to repair his fractured leg. More importantly, he was conscious and coherent, which meant I could interview him properly about what had happened. I told her I'd stop by during my shift if things stayed quiet, and she said visiting hours were flexible for law enforcement. Around 10 p.m., I drove over to the hospital and made my way to the patient's room. His name was Owen Cabot, according to the chart outside his door, and he was 53 years old with an address in Westchester County. When I knocked and entered, I found him propped up in bed with his leg in a cast, looking considerably better than he had lying in the forest the night before. He recognized me immediately and seemed relieved to see me, like he'd been waiting for someone to come talk to him about what had happened. I pulled up a chair and took out my notebook, and Owen started talking before I even asked my first question. He said he'd been thinking about it all day, trying to make sense of what he'd experienced, and he wanted to know if I'd found anything else at that house. I told him we'd documented the scene and were working with county officials to investigate the property, but I wanted to hear his full account of what had happened from the beginning. He nodded and settled back against his pillows, and his story came out in a steady stream. Owen had been driving home from a business meeting in Albany, taking the parkway south toward Westchester. It had been around 1:30 in the morning, and he'd been fighting to stay alert after a long day. He said he'd just come around one of those tight curves near mile marker 47 when he'd seen someone standing on the shoulder of the road. A woman, he was certain of it, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress or nightgown. She'd been just standing there, not waving for help or anything, just watching the road. Her presence had startled him so much that he'd swerved, and his front tire had caught the edge of the pavement wrong. He described losing control of the vehicle, feeling it slide toward the guardrail despite his attempts to correct. The impact had been violent, the sound of metal tearing and his airbag deploying all happening in what felt like a fraction of a second. When the car had finally stopped moving, he'd been disoriented, and his ears had been ringing from the airbag deployment. He'd managed to get his seatbelt off and climb out of the vehicle, which had been partially through the guardrail and tilted at a precarious angle. That's when he'd realized his car was in danger of sliding further down the embankment. So he'd scrambled away from it and started trying to figure out what to do. His phone had been destroyed in the crash, crushed between the seat and the center console, so he couldn't call for help. He'd looked up at the parkway and had seen the woman again, standing at the edge of the road where the guardrail was torn open. She'd been looking down at him, and even from that distance, he'd been able to see her face clearly in the ambient light from the parkway. She'd looked concerned, he said, like she was worried about him. Owen had called up to her, asking if she could call for help, but she hadn't responded. Instead, she'd turned and started walking down the embankment toward him, moving with an odd, gliding quality that he'd attributed at the time to his disorientation from the crash. As she got closer, he'd been able to see her more clearly, and that's when he'd noticed how old-fashioned her clothing was. Not costume party old-fashioned, but genuinely antique, like something from the 1950s. And her hair had been styled in a way that matched that era, pulled back in a way women didn't really wear it anymore. He'd asked her again if she had a phone, and she'd just gestured for him to follow her. She turned and walked into the forest, and Owen said he'd followed because he'd assumed she was leading him to a house or a road where he could get help. They'd walked for what felt like several minutes, though his sense of time had been distorted by the adrenaline and shock. The woman had stayed about 20 feet ahead of him the whole time, never looking back, just moving steadily through the trees with that same gliding motion. When they'd reached the clearing with the house, the woman had stopped at the edge of the woods and had pointed toward the structure. Owen said he'd looked at the house and then looked back at the woman to ask if this was where she lived, but she'd been gone. Just vanished, he said, between one moment and the next. He'd called out for her, had looked around the clearing, but there'd been no sign of where she'd gone. He'd been confused and starting to feel truly frightened, but the house had been right there with its light on, so he'd decided to go inside and look for help. His account of what happened inside matched what he'd told me the night before, but with more details now that he'd had time to process it. He said the interior of the house had felt wrong the moment he'd stepped inside, though he couldn't articulate exactly what had been wrong about it. The air had been too still, he said, and too cold, and there had been a smell like old flowers or perfume that had made him slightly nauseous. He'd called out but gotten no answer, so he'd started looking through the rooms for a phone or any sign of the woman who'd led him there. He'd found the living room with all its old furniture and photographs, and he'd noticed that several of the photos showed the same woman he'd seen on the parkway. Same face, same style of dress, though in the photos she'd looked younger, and the images had obviously been taken decades ago. That had unsettled him, but he'd rationalized it as maybe being her grandmother or another relative. Old houses had old pictures, that made sense. What didn't make sense was the feeling that he was being watched, that something in the house was aware of his presence and was paying very close attention to what he did. When he'd heard the sounds from upstairs, he'd convinced himself it must be someone who needed help. Maybe an elderly person who couldn't easily come down the stairs. So he'd started climbing, calling out that he meant no harm and just needed to use a phone. But with each step he took, the temperature had dropped and the air had gotten heavier, until he'd felt like he was walking through water. The sounds had gotten louder too, not clearer, just louder. Voices talking over each other, furniture being moved, doors opening and closing, all of it coming from the second floor. Owen's hands were shaking as he described what he'd seen when he'd reached the top of the stairs. The hallway had been dark despite the fact that he could see light coming from under some of the doors. And those doors had been opening and closing, not violently but purposefully, like someone was going from room to room looking for something. He'd taken a few steps down the hallway, heading toward the nearest door, when something had made him stop. A feeling, he said, an overwhelming certainty that he needed to leave immediately, that something terrible would happen if he stayed. He'd turned and run back down the stairs, nearly falling in his haste to get out of the house. When he'd burst out the front door, the fear had been so intense that he hadn't stopped running. He'd just kept going, crashing through the forest in the darkness, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and that house. That's when he'd tripped over a root or a rock and had fallen badly, breaking his leg and finding himself unable to continue. He'd lain there in the darkness, terrified that something from the house was going to follow him, until he'd heard me calling out and had realized help had arrived. I listened to all of this and took careful notes, and when Owen finished, I asked him a few clarifying questions. Had he seen anyone else inside the house besides hearing the sounds upstairs? No. He'd been alone on the ground floor. Had he noticed anything unusual about the furniture or the condition of the interior? It had all looked old but well maintained, he said, like someone was taking care of the place. Had he touched anything or moved anything while he was inside? He'd touched a few pieces of furniture as he'd walked through, leaning on them for support because he'd been feeling dizzy from the crash, but he hadn't deliberately moved or taken anything. When I asked him about the woman he'd seen, he became very quiet. After a long moment, he said he knew how it sounded, that he knew I probably thought he'd been concussed and had imagined the whole thing. But he was certain of what he'd seen. The woman had been real. She'd been standing on that parkway and she'd led him to that house. Why she'd done that, what she'd wanted, he had no idea. But he was convinced now that the whole thing had been deliberate, that he'd been meant to go into that house for some reason he didn't understand. I didn't tell him what Trent and I had found during our investigation, didn't mention the Marchand family, or the fact that the house was supposed to have been demolished 60 years ago. I just thanked him for his cooperation and told him to focus on recovering. If we needed any additional information, I'd be in touch. As I was leaving, Owen called out to me and asked if I was going to go back to the house. I told him that was likely, that we needed to conduct a more thorough investigation. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and said I should be careful, that there was something in that house that didn't want to be found or disturbed. I left the hospital thinking about Owen's warning and about the woman he'd described. The description matched several of the photographs I'd seen inside the house, particularly the pictures of the woman who appeared to be the original owner. If the house had belonged to the Marchand family, and if that woman in the photos was Eliza Marchand as I suspected, then what did it mean that Owen had seen someone who looked exactly like her standing on the parkway? The obvious explanation was that he'd been disoriented from the crash and had imagined the whole thing, but that didn't account for how he'd found the house, or why his description of the interior matched so perfectly with what I'd seen. When I got back to my cruiser, I found a message from dispatch saying that someone from the county assessor's office had called and wanted to speak with me about the house. I called the number and got through to a woman who introduced herself as Patricia Everett from the Property Records Department. She said she'd been looking into the history of the land where I'd found the house, and she'd discovered some interesting information. The property had indeed belonged to a family named Marchand, specifically to a woman named Eliza Marchand who'd lived there with her husband until his death in 1959. According to the records Patricia had found, Eliza had fought the eminent domain seizure of her property when the state had begun acquiring land for the parkway. She'd argued that the house was far enough from the planned road that it wouldn't need to be demolished, and she'd refused multiple offers to buy her out. The legal battle had gone on for several years, and during that time, construction on that section of the parkway had been delayed. Eventually, the state had won the case, and Eliza had been forced to vacate the property in early 1963. What happened after that was where the records got murky. There was documentation showing that the property had been acquired and that Eliza had been compensated, but there was no clear record of what had happened to the house itself. The demolition that was supposed to have taken place was referenced in a few memos, but there was no completion certificate or any photos documenting that the work had been done. And there was no record of what had happened to Eliza Marchand after she'd left the property. No death certificate. No forwarding address. Nothing. Patricia said she'd been through all the available records and had found one more interesting detail. In 1964, about a year after Eliza was supposed to have vacated the property, there had been a complaint filed with the state police about trespassing on the old Marchand land. Someone had reported seeing lights in the windows of a house that was no longer supposed to exist, and had asked the police to investigate. There was a brief incident report that indicated a trooper had been sent to check it out, but the report was incomplete and didn't include any findings or resolution. I asked Patricia if she could find out who that trooper had been and if there was any way to access more detailed records from that incident. She said she'd try, but warned me that records from that era were spotty at best, and a lot of them had been lost or destroyed over the years. She also mentioned that she'd be willing to come out to the site with me if I wanted to do another investigation of the house, as her office would need to document the structure for their records anyway. I told her I'd let her know when I planned to go back, and we ended the call. The rest of my shift was relatively quiet, which gave me plenty of time to think about everything I'd learned. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they were forming a picture that didn't make logical sense. Eliza Marchand had lived in that house and had fought to keep it. She'd lost that fight and had been forced to leave, and shortly after, the house was supposed to have been demolished. But somehow it hadn't been, and a year later, someone had reported seeing lights in it. Now, 60 years after all of that, the house was still there. Still apparently occupied at least some of the time, and people were still seeing a woman who looked exactly like Eliza Marchand. Over the next few days, I did some digging on my own time, trying to find any additional information about Eliza and what had happened to her. I went to the local historical society and looked through their archives, and I found a few newspaper clippings about the eminent domain case. The articles painted a picture of a woman who'd been fiercely independent and deeply attached to her home. In one interview from 1962, Eliza had told a reporter that the house was all she had left after her husband's death, and that forcing her to leave it would be like forcing her to leave her own life behind. The Historical Society also had a few photographs of the parkway construction from that era, and in one of them you could see the Marchand house in the background, still standing while construction equipment worked nearby. The photo was dated March 1963, which would have been right around the time Eliza was forced to vacate. I took pictures of all the documents and photographs I found, thinking they might be useful for the investigation. I also tried to find any living relatives of Eliza Marchand, anyone who might remember her or know what happened after she left the house. It took some work, but I eventually tracked down a woman who said she'd been Eliza's great-niece. Her name was Dorothy Brennan, and she was in her 70s now, living in a nursing home in Dutchess County. I called her and explained that I was investigating a property that had once belonged to her great-aunt, and she agreed to speak with me if I wanted to visit. I drove out to the nursing home on my next day off and found Dorothy to be sharp and articulate despite her age. She remembered Eliza well, having visited her at the house several times when she was a child in the late 1950s. She described Eliza as a formidable woman who'd been deeply unhappy after her husband's death and who'd become increasingly isolated. The house had been everything to her, Dorothy said, the only place where she'd felt close to her late husband's memory. When I asked Dorothy what had happened to Eliza after she'd been forced to leave the property, her expression became troubled. She said that Eliza had stayed with Dorothy's family for a few weeks after the eviction, but she'd been like a ghost, barely eating or speaking, just sitting by the window and staring out at nothing. Then one morning, Dorothy's parents had woken up to find that Eliza was gone. She'd left in the middle of the night without taking any of her belongings, and no one had seen her since. Dorothy's parents had filed a missing person report, but the police had never found any trace of Eliza. The family had eventually concluded that Eliza had probably taken her own life somewhere remote, overwhelmed by the loss of her home and her husband. It was a tragic ending, but Dorothy said it had made a certain kind of sense given how devastated Eliza had been. What didn't make sense, Dorothy added, was what happened afterward. For years after Eliza's disappearance, Dorothy's family had received reports from people who claimed to have seen her. Always in the same area, always near where her house had stood. Drivers would report seeing a woman matching her description standing on the side of the parkway, and hikers would sometimes mention encountering her in the forest. Dorothy said her family had investigated some of these reports, but they'd never found anything concrete. The sightings had continued sporadically for decades, becoming something of a local legend. People called her the Parkway Woman or the Lady of the Guardrail, and there were all sorts of stories about her. Some said she was a ghost haunting the place where her home had been. Others said she was still alive and living rough in the forest, driven mad by what had been done to her. Dorothy herself didn't know what to believe, but she said she'd always felt that her great-aunt had never really left that property, that some part of her was still there. I showed Dorothy the photographs I'd taken of the house and the pictures I'd found inside it. When she saw the photos of the woman I believed to be Eliza, her eyes filled with tears. She confirmed that it was indeed her great-aunt, looking much as she had in the late 50s. When I showed her photos of the house as it appeared now, she was shocked to see how little it had changed. It looked almost exactly as she remembered it from her childhood visits, maybe a bit more weathered, but fundamentally the same. Before I left, Dorothy asked me what I planned to do about the house. I told her honestly that I wasn't sure, that we were still trying to figure out the legal status of the property and what our options were. She nodded and then said something that has stayed with me. She said that some places hold on to the people who loved them, that they become more than just structures of wood and stone. Her great-aunt had loved that house so much that losing it had destroyed her, and maybe that love had been strong enough to leave an imprint, a presence that lingered long after the person herself was gone. Driving back from the nursing home, I thought about Dorothy's words and about everything I'd learned. The house was real, that much was certain. But was it also something more than real? Was it possible that Eliza Marchand's attachment to the property had been so strong that it had somehow preserved the house beyond its natural lifespan, kept it existing in some in-between state where it was neither fully present nor fully gone? The rational part of my mind rejected that idea, but I couldn't deny what I'd experienced and what Owen Cabot had experienced. That evening, I met up with Trent Holloway for coffee before our shift started, and I filled him in on everything I'd learned. Trent listened carefully and didn't interrupt, and when I finished, he sat back and thought for a long moment. Finally, he said that regardless of what supernatural elements might or might not be involved, we had a real structure on state land that posed potential safety hazards. People were getting hurt, like Owen Cabot, and we had a responsibility to secure the property and figure out what to do with it. He suggested we organize a proper investigation with county officials and maybe some structural engineers to assess the building's condition. I agreed that was the sensible approach, but I also felt a growing sense of urgency about the whole situation. Something about that house was pulling at me, making me feel like time was running out for reasons I couldn't articulate. I suggested to Trent that we should go back one more time before bringing in a whole team of officials, just to make sure we hadn't missed anything important during our first investigation. He was hesitant, but eventually agreed, and we decided to make the trip the following night when we were both on shift and could justify being in the area. The next evening started normally enough. Trent and I met up around midnight and headed toward the section of the parkway where the house was located. We'd brought better equipment this time, including proper climbing gear for navigating the embankment, high-powered flashlights, and a camera with a good flash for documenting anything we found. We also brought copies of the old photographs I'd found at the Historical Society, thinking they might help us understand the layout of the property better. When we reached mile marker 47, we parked on the shoulder and geared up. The damaged guardrail had been temporarily repaired with reflective barriers, making it easier to identify the spot. We climbed over the barrier and started making our way down the embankment, using our flashlights to navigate the steep slope. The descent was easier than it had been the first time because we knew where we were going, but it still took us a good 10 minutes to reach the bottom. As we approached the tree line, I felt that same sense of wrongness I'd experienced before. That feeling that we were crossing into a space that operated under different rules. Trent felt it too. I could tell by the way his posture changed, and how he kept looking around as if expecting something to appear. We pushed through the underbrush and emerged into the clearing, and there it was. The house sitting exactly where it had been before, but tonight all the windows were dark, no lights burning inside, no signs of any presence or activity. We approached the front porch slowly, both of us hyper-alert to anything unusual. The rocking chair I'd noticed before was still there, but it had been moved slightly, positioned differently than I remembered. Trent tried the front door and found it locked, just as it had been the last time we'd come back in daylight. We circled the house, checking all the ground floor windows and looking for any other way in. All of them were locked or sealed, but through the windows we could see the interior, still furnished and seemingly unchanged. Trent suggested we try to find a basement entrance or a cellar door, thinking that might give us access to the interior. We searched the perimeter of the house and eventually found what we were looking for on the north side, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It was an old-style cellar door, the kind that opened upward on hinges, and it wasn't locked. Trent and I looked at each other, both of us aware that we were about to cross a line. Legally speaking, we were on shaky ground entering a structure without clearer authorization. But the unusual circumstances of the situation gave us some justification. Trent pulled the cellar door open, and we were hit with a wave of cold, damp air that smelled of earth and decay. Our flashlight beams revealed a set of rough wooden stairs leading down into darkness. I went first, testing each step carefully before putting my full weight on it, very aware that some of these boards might have rotted through after decades of exposure to moisture. Trent followed close behind, and we descended into what turned out to be a surprisingly large basement. The space was mostly empty, just a dirt floor and stone foundation walls, but there were a few items scattered around that caught our attention. Old furniture that looked like it had been stored down here and forgotten. Some cardboard boxes that had deteriorated to the point where their contents had spilled out. And in one corner, something that made both of us stop and stare. It was a makeshift living area, with a sleeping bag, some empty food containers, and a battery-powered lantern. Someone had been staying down here, and recently too, based on the condition of the items. Trent and I searched the basement thoroughly, documenting everything with photographs and looking for any indication of who might have been using this space. We found a few pieces of trash with dates on them, receipts and food wrappers that were only a few months old. But we didn't find any identification or anything that would tell us who the person was. What we did find, tucked into a corner and partially hidden by an old tarp, was a journal. It was a simple composition notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore, and it was filled with handwriting. I picked up the journal carefully and started leafing through it, and what I found made my blood run cold. The entries were dated going back about 8 months, and they appeared to be written by someone who'd been living in or around the house for all that time. The writer never gave their name, but they referred to themselves as a caretaker, someone who'd taken on the responsibility of looking after the property. The entries described routine maintenance tasks, like cleaning the windows and sweeping the floors, but they also described something else. They described interactions with someone the writer called the Lady, a presence in the house that the writer seemed to believe was real and aware. The early entries were matter-of-fact, almost mundane, but as they progressed, they became increasingly disturbed. The writer described hearing voices and footsteps when they were alone in the house, seeing doors open and close on their own, and feeling watched by something unseen. They wrote about finding items moved or rearranged in ways they couldn't explain, and about nights where the temperature in certain rooms would drop to near freezing for no apparent reason. But through all of this, the writer maintained that they had a duty to stay, that the Lady needed someone to keep the house in order so she could remain. The final entry in the journal was dated about 3 weeks before I'd first discovered the house, and it was much shorter than the others. It simply said, "She's getting stronger. The boundary is thin now. I can't stay here anymore. God forgive me for abandoning my post." After that, the pages were blank. Whoever had been living here and maintaining the house had apparently decided they couldn't handle it anymore and had left. But if that was the case, who had turned on that light the night I'd first arrived? Who had been sleeping in that upstairs bedroom? Trent and I continued our search of the basement, but we didn't find anything else of significance. We made our way to the interior stairs that led up into the house proper and found a door at the top. I tried the knob, half expecting it to be locked like all the exterior doors, but it opened easily. We stepped through into what appeared to be a kitchen, the same room I'd seen on my first visit. Everything looked exactly as it had before. The old stove and refrigerator still in place, the dishes still in the sink. We moved through the ground floor methodically, photographing everything and comparing what we saw with the old photos from the Historical Society. The furniture matched, the layout matched. Even some of the decorative items on shelves and mantels were the same ones visible in photographs from the 1950s. It was like the house had been frozen in time, preserved exactly as it had been when Eliza Marchand had lived here. The only differences were the inevitable signs of age and wear, the dust and the slight decay that comes with decades of existence. When we reached the stairs leading to the second floor, we both paused. This was where Owen Cabot had experienced whatever had frightened him so badly. This was where the journal writer had described the strongest manifestations of the Lady. Trent looked at me and asked if I was sure I wanted to go up there, and I nodded. We'd come this far, and we needed to see this through. We started climbing, our flashlight beams cutting through the darkness ahead of us, and with each step, I felt that same heavy pressure in the air that Owen had described. The second-floor hallway was exactly as I remembered it from my first visit, but somehow it felt different at night with just our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was noticeably colder up here, cold enough that I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of my face. Trent noticed it too, and muttered something about the house lacking insulation, but we both knew that didn't explain the temperature difference. The ground floor had been cool, but not frigid like this. We moved down the hallway slowly, checking each room methodically. The first bedroom we entered was sparsely furnished with a single bed and a dresser, everything covered in a thick layer of dust that showed no recent disturbance. The second bedroom was similar, frozen in time like a museum display. But when we reached the third bedroom, the one where I'd seen signs of recent use during my first visit, we found something that made us both stop cold. The bed was made now, the covers pulled up neat and tight, and on the pillow was a single photograph in a frame. I approached the bed carefully and picked up the photograph. It showed a young couple standing in front of this house, probably taken in the late 1940s or early 50s, based on their clothing and the photo quality. The woman was Eliza Marchand, I was certain of it, looking younger than in the photos I'd seen downstairs. The man next to her had his arm around her waist, and they were both smiling at the camera with the kind of happiness that seemed to come from a simpler time. I turned the photo over and found an inscription on the back, written in faded ink, "Robert and Eliza, summer 1949. Trent leaned over my shoulder to look at the photo and asked if I thought someone had deliberately placed it there. I didn't have an answer. The bed had been disturbed during my first visit, unmade and showing signs of recent use. Now it was perfectly made with this photo placed carefully on the pillow, like an offering or a message. I took several pictures of the scene with my camera, then carefully set the framed photo back where I'd found it. Something about disturbing it felt wrong, like I'd be violating something sacred. We continued our search of the second floor and found the bathroom at the end of the hall. It was old-fashioned with a clawfoot tub and a pedestal sink, everything clean despite the age of the fixtures. When Trent opened the medicine cabinet above the sink, we found it was still stocked with various items from another era. Old bottles of aspirin and cold remedies, a straight razor, a powder compact. All of it appeared to be from the 1950s or 60s, preserved as if the house had been abandoned overnight rather than gradually over decades. As we were documenting the bathroom, we both heard it, a sound from somewhere below us, like a door closing. We froze and listened, hands instinctively moving to our service weapons. The sound came again, definitely a door, and then we heard what might have been footsteps on the ground floor. Trent and I looked at each other, communicating silently. Someone else was in the house. We moved back into the hallway and towards the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible while also making sure we didn't surprise whoever was down there into doing something dangerous. We descended the stairs with our flashlights raised and our free hands on our weapons, announcing ourselves as state troopers and ordering whoever was in the house to identify themselves. There was no response, but the sounds continued. More footsteps, this time in what sounded like the kitchen. We reached the ground floor and moved toward the kitchen, our flashlight beams sweeping through the darkness ahead of us. When we entered the kitchen, it was empty, no one there, no sign that anyone had been there, but we'd both heard those sounds clear as day. Trent suggested that maybe it was the house settling, old wood contracting in the cold air, but neither of us really believed that. The sounds had been too deliberate, too much like actual footsteps and doors. We searched the ground floor again, checking every room and every closet, but found nothing. The house was empty, except for us. As we were standing in the living room trying to decide what to do next, we both noticed something that hadn't been there before. The photographs on the walls had been rearranged. Not all of them, but several had been moved to different positions, and one that I was certain had been hanging near the fireplace was now on the opposite wall. I pointed this out to Trent, and he examined the walls more closely. He confirmed that the nail holes didn't match up with where the pictures were now hanging, that they'd definitely been moved. But when we checked our earlier photos on the camera, we could see that the pictures had been in different positions when we'd first entered the house tonight. Someone, or something, had rearranged them while we'd been upstairs, doing it silently enough that we hadn't heard anything beyond those few footsteps and the door closing. That's when I noticed something else. The photograph I'd been looking at during my first visit, the one showing Eliza with her neighbors, was now positioned prominently in the center of the mantel. It had been tucked in with several other photos before, but now it was front and center, impossible to miss. And next to it was another photo I didn't remember seeing before, showing just Eliza standing alone in front of the house, her expression somber and her eyes seeming to look directly at the camera with an intensity that was unsettling. Trent was starting to look genuinely unnerved now, and I couldn't blame him. This was going beyond anything we could rationalize away as coincidence or misremembering. Things in this house were moving, changing, responding to our presence in ways that shouldn't be possible. I suggested we head back outside and call for additional units, maybe get some more equipment and come back during daylight. Trent agreed immediately, and we started making our way toward the front door. That's when all the lights in the house came on at once. Every room, every fixture, everything blazed to life with an intensity that made us both shield our eyes. The sudden brightness was disorienting after spending so much time in the dark with just our flashlights, and for a moment, I couldn't process what was happening. Then I realized what was wrong. The house shouldn't have power. We'd established during our first investigation that it wasn't connected to the grid, and there was no generator that we'd been able to find. The lights stayed on for maybe 10 seconds, long enough for us to see the interior of the house in full detail. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every detail was suddenly visible in a way it hadn't been before. And in that light, I could see something else. There were wet footprints on the floor, leading from the kitchen toward the stairs. Not muddy prints like someone had tracked in dirt from outside, but wet prints like someone had been walking in water. They were small, definitely made by a woman's shoe, and they were fresh enough that water was still pooling slightly in each impression. Then the lights went out just as suddenly as they'd come on, plunging us back into darkness. Our flashlights seemed dim and inadequate after that blaze of illumination, and we both stood there for a moment trying to adjust. When I could see properly again, I looked down at where I'd seen the footprints. They were still there, still wet, leading from the kitchen up the stairs we'd just descended. Someone had gone upstairs while we'd been down here, had walked right past us in the darkness while we'd been distracted by the rearranged photographs. I knew we should leave. Every instinct I had was screaming that we needed to get out of this house and not come back without significant backup and maybe some people who dealt with situations that fell outside normal police work. But I also felt a pull to follow those footprints, to see where they led and who or what had made them. I looked at Trent, and I could see he was feeling the same conflict. We'd come this far, and leaving now without answers felt wrong. We followed the footprints back up the stairs, our flashlights trained on each wet impression. They led us down the hallway toward the bedroom where I'd found the photograph, and we could see that the door, which had been open when we'd left, was now closed. I approached it slowly and called out, identifying myself again as a state trooper and asking whoever was inside to come out with their hands visible. There was no response, just silence from behind that closed door. I reached for the doorknob, and Trent positioned himself to cover me in case something went wrong. The knob was ice cold, cold enough that it hurt to touch, but I turned it anyway and pushed the door open. The bedroom beyond was exactly as we'd left it, the bed perfectly made with the photographs still on the pillow. Except now there was something else. Sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows beyond our flashlight beams, was a figure. My hand went to my weapon, and I ordered the figure to stand up and identify themselves. They didn't move, didn't respond at all. As we got closer and our lights illuminated the figure more clearly, I realized with a sick feeling that it wasn't a person. It was a dress, an old-fashioned dress from the 1950s, arranged on the chair as if someone was wearing it. But there was no one inside it, just the empty dress with shoes positioned beneath it and gloves placed where hands should be. Trent swept his flashlight around the rest of the room, checking for any actual person who might be hiding, but we were alone except for that disturbing arrangement in the chair. When I looked more closely at the dress, I recognized it from the photographs downstairs. It was the same dress Eliza Marchand had been wearing in several of the pictures, a floral print that had probably been quite fashionable in its time. Someone had carefully arranged it here, had set it up like a shrine or a memorial, and recently too, based on the fact that it hadn't been here during our last visit to this room. I was backing away from the chair, intending to photograph it and then get us both out of this house, when I heard Trent make a sound of surprise behind me. I turned to find him staring at the bed, and when I looked, I saw that the photograph on the pillow had changed. It was no longer the picture of the young couple from 1949. Now it was a different photo. This one showing Eliza much older, standing in front of the house with a haunted, desperate expression. Her hair was gray, and her face was lined with age and sorrow. The inscription on the back, which I could see because the photo had been turned face down, read, "The last day, March 1963. That was it. That was the day Eliza had been forced to leave her home. I understood in that moment what we were seeing, what the house was trying to show us. This wasn't just a structure that had somehow survived demolition. It was a place that held the memory of what had been taken, of the life that had been lived here and the grief that had come from its loss. Whether that was some kind of paranormal presence or just the accumulated emotional weight of history, I couldn't say. But I knew we needed to leave, and we needed to leave now. I grabbed Trent's arm and told him we were going. He didn't argue, and we moved quickly back down the hallway toward the stairs. As we descended, all around us, we could hear the house responding. Doors opening and closing. Footsteps on the floor above us. Voices murmuring just beyond the range of comprehension. It was like the house was waking up, becoming more active and more present with each second we stayed inside it. By the time we reached the ground floor, the sounds had become almost deafening. A cacophony of normal household noises all happening at once. We ran for the front door and found it locked. I fumbled with the deadbolt while Trent covered our backs, keeping his flashlight trained on the rooms behind us. The lock finally gave way, and we burst out onto the front porch and down the steps into the clearing. We didn't stop running until we'd reached the tree line, and even then we kept moving, scrambling up the embankment as fast as we could manage. Behind us, we could see the house, and every window was lit up now, bright as day, light spilling out into the clearing like a beacon. We reached the top of the embankment and climbed over the guardrail barrier, both of us breathing hard and trying to process what we'd just experienced. We stood there for a moment, looking down at where the house was hidden by the trees, and as we watched, the lights began to go out one by one. First the upper floor, then the ground floor, until only that single window we'd first seen was lit. Then that too went dark, and the forest was left in darkness. Trent and I got into our cruisers without saying much of anything. We'd both just experienced something that defied explanation, and neither of us was ready to talk about it yet. I followed him back to the barracks, and we spent the next several hours writing up reports that tried to document what we'd found without straying too far into territory that might get us sent for psychological evaluations. We stuck to the facts. The house existed. It showed signs of recent habitation. We'd found evidence of someone living there who'd since departed, and the structure needed to be secured and investigated by appropriate authorities. What we didn't put in our reports was everything else: the moving photographs, the footprints, the lights coming on with no power source, the dress arranged in the chair, the sounds of footsteps and doors. We didn't mention how the house had seemed to respond to our presence, how it had shown us specific things like it was trying to communicate something. Those details went unwritten, shared only between the two of us in quiet conversations, where we tried to make sense of what had happened. Over the next few weeks, I followed up with the county authorities about the house, trying to get someone to take action on securing the property. But every time I pushed, I ran into bureaucratic obstacles. Questions about jurisdiction, about whether the property was even legally on state land, given the confusion in the records, about liability and resource allocation. It was like the system itself was resistant to dealing with the house, finding every possible reason to delay or avoid taking action. I went back to the site twice more on my own during daylight hours, trying to find the house again. The first time, I searched for over 2 hours and never found the clearing. The embankment was there, the forest was there, but the house had seemingly vanished. The second time, I brought detailed GPS coordinates from our previous visits, but when I followed them to where the house should be, I found only dense forest with no sign that any structure had ever stood there. I called Trent after that second failed attempt, and he admitted he'd tried to find it too and had failed. We compared notes and realized we'd both experienced the same thing. The house was simply gone, or at least we couldn't access it anymore. It was like it had shown itself to us for a brief period and then had withdrawn back into whatever space it normally occupied, hidden from the world that had tried to destroy it decades ago. I spoke with Owen Cabot one more time, about a month after his accident. He'd recovered well from his injuries and was back at work, but he said he still thought about that night and about the woman he'd seen. He asked if we'd ever figured out who she was, and I told him what I'd learned about Eliza Marchand. He listened quietly and then told me he'd driven past that section of the parkway several times since his accident, and each time he felt compelled to look toward where the house had been. He said he never saw anything in the daylight, but at night, sometimes he thought he could see a faint light through the trees, like a single window lit from inside. I didn't tell him that I'd seen the same thing, that on night patrols, when I drove past mile marker 47, I sometimes caught a glimpse of that light in my peripheral vision. If I tried to look directly at it, it would vanish, but if I kept my eyes on the road and just let it remain at the edge of my awareness, I could see it clearly. A single lit window in a house that wasn't supposed to exist, a beacon for travelers who'd lost their way, or maybe a remnant of a life that had refused to surrender even after everything had been taken. Dorothy Brennan called me a few weeks later and asked if I'd learned anything more about her great-aunt's property. I told her about our investigation and about the difficulties we were having getting official action taken. She listened and then said something that struck me. She said that maybe the house didn't want to be found by people who were just doing their jobs, that maybe it only showed itself to people who needed to see it for some reason. People like Owen Cabot, who'd been in an accident and needed shelter, or people like me who'd been looking for answers to questions I didn't even know I had. I've thought about that a lot in the months since all of this happened. What had the house been trying to show us? Why had it allowed us inside and then demonstrated its presence so dramatically? I keep coming back to that photograph that had changed on the bed, the one showing Eliza on her last day in the house. The expression on her face had been one of profound loss, but also defiance, like she was refusing to accept what was happening even as she was forced to comply with it. Maybe that's what the house represents. A refusal to be forgotten, a resistance to the idea that something can be erased just because it's inconvenient or in the way of progress. Eliza Marchand had fought to keep her home, and had lost that fight through no fault of her own. But some part of her, some essence or memory or will, had remained behind and had kept the house existing in whatever space it now occupied. Not quite part of the physical world anymore, but not entirely gone either. I still patrol the Hudson Valley, still drive past that section of the Taconic State Parkway several times a week. The damaged guardrail has been properly repaired now, and there's nothing to indicate that anything unusual ever happened there. But I know better. I know that beyond that guardrail and down that embankment, hidden in the forest that the parkway cut through, there's a house that shouldn't exist, but does anyway. A place where the past and present overlap. Where a woman who lost everything continues to maintain her vigil, waiting for something I can't begin to understand. Sometimes on quiet nights, when traffic is light and I'm alone with my thoughts, I'll pull over near mile marker 47 and just sit for a while. I'll watch the tree line and occasionally, just occasionally, I'll see that light again. That single window lit from inside, warm and inviting in the darkness. And I'll wonder about Eliza Marchand and what her life was like in that house before it was taken from her. I'll think about the love she must have had for the place, strong enough to transcend death and decades and the physical destruction that was supposed to have erased it from existence. The journal we found in the basement, the one written by the mysterious caretaker, mentioned that the boundary is thin now. I've thought about that phrase a lot. What boundary was the writer referring to? The boundary between past and present, between the living and the dead, between the world as we understand it and something else, something that operates under different rules and different logic. I don't have answers, just more questions that pile up with each passing week. Trent and I don't talk about the house much anymore. It's like an unspoken agreement between us that some experiences are better left unexamined too closely. We did what we were supposed to do as troopers. We responded to an accident, we investigated an unusual situation, we documented our findings and submitted our reports. That the situation turned out to involve something beyond normal police work, well, that's just part of the job sometimes. Not everything fits into neat categories, and not every case gets closed with clear answers. But I keep the photographs I took at the house stored on a secure drive, and sometimes I'll look through them late at night when I can't sleep. I'll study the pictures of that family from decades ago, the furniture frozen in time, the personal effects left behind, as if the residents had just stepped out for a moment. And I'll look at the pictures we took on our final visit, the ones showing the rearranged photographs and the dress in the chair and all the other small impossibilities we documented. There's one photo in particular that I keep coming back to. It's a shot Trent took of the living room from the doorway, just a standard documentation photo of the scene. But when I enlarge it and look carefully, there's something in the corner of the frame, a shadow that might be a person, or might just be a trick of the light and the angle. It's too indistinct to say for certain, but the shape suggests a woman standing near the fireplace, watching us as we photographed her home. I've never shown this photo to anyone else, not even Trent. Some things are better kept private, observed but not shared. 6 years as a state trooper has taught me that the world is stranger and more complex than any training manual or procedural guideline can account for. You respond to calls, you investigate situations, and you try to help people while following the law and maintaining public safety. But sometimes you encounter something that falls outside all of that, something that forces you to expand your understanding of what's real and what's possible. The Marchand house is one of those things for me. I still drive the Taconic State Parkway several nights a week. I still pass mile marker 47 and glance toward the tree line, looking for that light. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet and still, I see it. That single window glowing warm against the darkness. A reminder that some things refuse to be erased, that love and attachment can be strong enough to transcend the physical limitations we think govern reality. I don't know if Eliza Marchand is still there in some form, still maintaining her vigil in the house she refused to surrender. But I hope she is. I hope she found a way to keep what mattered to her even if the rest of the world decided it was expendable. The house beyond the guardrail exists. I've been inside it, walked its rooms, felt its presence. And even though I can't find it anymore, even though it seems to have withdrawn into some protected space where people like me can't easily access it, I know it's there, waiting in the darkness beyond the parkway, showing itself when it chooses to, reminding certain travelers that the past is never as dead as we like to think it is. That's the truth I carry with me on every shift, every patrol, every time I drive through the Hudson Valley in the deep hours of the night. Some places hold on to the people who loved them. Dorothy had been right about that. And sometimes those places become more than just structures. They become manifestations of will and memory and refusal, existing in the spaces between what we can explain and what we simply have to accept. The Marchand house is out there, beyond the guardrail, hidden in the forest. And it's waiting, always waiting, for the next person who needs to find it.